Deep in the shadows of ancient tradition sits a work that once echoed through early Christianity, and then, little by little, faded from the Western Bible until it was almost as if it had never existed. It is a book that the New Testament itself appears to quote, yet for centuries it survived outside most Western churches, preserved in full only far from Rome and Constantinople, guarded in the highlands of Ethiopia. The name of that book still carries an electric charge, the Book of Enoch. People whisper that it vanished because it says too much, because it dares to describe things the comfortable versions of faith prefer to leave undefined. It tells of a company of powerful heavenly beings, watchers appointed to observe humanity, who did the unthinkable. They abandoned their station, violated their oath, and crossed the boundary between the immortal and the mortal. And in doing so, they set in motion a chain of consequences so catastrophic that the story feels like a warning carved into the bones of history. Why would angels risk heaven itself for a life on earth? What could be so compelling, so dangerously beautiful, that they would trade eternity for appetite, desire, curiosity, power? And what is the truth behind the Nephilim, the giants said to be born from that forbidden union? Beings described as neither fully human nor fully divine, a living symbol of boundaries shattered. Tonight, imagine opening that forbidden doorway again, not to sensationalize it, not to chase fear for its own sake, but to understand why these pages unsettled so many authorities and why generations kept returning to them anyway. Let the story be a voice in the dark. You don't need to watch anything, just listen, and allow your mind to travel to the world. The book claims existed before the flood, when one rebellion in the heavens helped ignite an age of violence on the earth. Enoch himself is one of the most mysterious figures in the Bible. In the book of Genesis, his story is strikingly brief, almost painfully so. He walked with God, and then he was gone because God took him. It reads like a doorway opening for a moment and then closing. That single line has fueled centuries of wonder. Unlike other patriarchs who live, age, and die, Enoch is described as removed from ordinary human fate. The language suggests ascent, translation, a crossing into realms humans are not meant to map. Ancient tradition steps into the silence and fills it with a claim as bold as it is captivating. Enoch did not simply disappear. He was taken up, shown the architecture of the heavens, and entrusted with visions meant for later generations. According to that tradition, Enoch saw layers of heavenly order and the hidden workings of creation. He learned the courses of the sun and moon, the gates of light, the rhythm by which seasons turn and time unfolds. He witnessed the judgment that waits in the unseen world. He heard names of angels, ranks and powers, and he saw destinies. The fate of rebellious spirits, the hope of the righteous, the end of corruption, and the arrival of a final reckoning. Then the tradition says he returned not to settle back into ordinary life, but to leave behind testimony, writings, a record, words meant to outlive him. Modern scholarship, however, tends to approach the Book of Enoch differently. Many researchers believe what we call one Enoch is not a single memoir penned by one ancient man in one sitting, but a collection that took shape across time, gathered, expanded, preserved, and compiled over centuries. In that view, its components likely began circulating in the centuries before Christ and were shaped into a fuller collection by around the 1st century of the Common Era. Portions appear to have been composed in the languages of the ancient Near East Hebrew or Aramaic before being transmitted and ultimately preserved most completely in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. And fragments discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls help confirm that Enochic writings were known and valued within some Jewish communities in antiquity, treated not as mere folklore but as something carrying religious weight. One reason the Book of Enoch grips the imagination is that it doesn't read like a single, straight narrative. It feels more like a cathedral built from multiple chambers, each opening into a different kind of vision. It is commonly understood in 5 major movements, 5 windows into a world both cosmic and unsettling. First comes what is often called the Book of the Watchers. Here the story turns toward the angels, specifically a group described as watchers, heavenly beings assigned to observe humanity. But observation becomes involvement, and involvement becomes violation. They descend, not as messengers delivering a word and then departing, but as beings who linger. They choose human women, take them as wives, and produce offspring that are depicted as monstrous in power and appetite. The Nephilim, giants who bring devastation rather than harmony. The Watchers, the book says, also bring forbidden instruction knowledge humanity was not ready to carry. Not merely craft, but corrupting skill, weapon making, beautification used for manipulation, occult practices, enchantments, the bending of boundaries that were meant to protect. The result is not enlightenment, but moral collapse, an accelerating spiral of violence, exploitation, and bloodshed. And so the Watchers are seized, bound, and imprisoned in darkness to await a final judgment, while the earth groans under the consequences of what they unleashed. Then the book shifts into parables visions, where judgment takes on a face. A figure appears who is often called the Son of Man, portrayed as chosen, empowered, and destined to judge not only human wickedness, but the rebellious powers behind it. The language is charged with authority and inevitability, and readers across centuries have argued about how to interpret it, whether it points toward a messianic hope, whether it parallels later Christian understandings, or whether it represents an earlier apocalyptic expectation. Regardless of where one lands, the intensity is unmistakable. The universe is not indifferent, and injustice will not be the final word. Next comes the astronomical book, where Enoch is guided through a vision of time itself, gates of light, movements of heavenly bodies, patterns meant to reveal that creation has order. It describes a calendar that feels precise, almost obsessive in its symmetry, as though the author is insisting that chaos is not the true foundation of reality. Even if readers don't take its astronomy as science, the symbolism remains potent. The heavens keep their courses, and all rebellion, whether human or angelic, is, in the end, measured against a deeper design. After that arrives dream visions, where history is retold as allegory. Nations and peoples appear as animals, and the story of humanity becomes a sweeping panorama from earliest beginnings through crisis, conflict, and eventual reckoning. It reads like prophecy and commentary at once, a way of saying, what happens on earth has meaning, and it fits into a larger story. Finally, the book closes with what is often called the Epistle of Enoch, a section filled with warnings, blessings, moral urgency, and a vision of history unfolding in distinct ages like weeks of time marching toward judgment and renewal. Here, the Book of Enoch becomes less about cosmic spectacle and more about ethical pressure. It insists that choices matter, that corruption is not merely social or political but spiritual, that the world bends toward accountability. So why, if it was known and respected in many early circles, did it disappear from the Western canon? The simplest honest answer is that there was no single dramatic moment where a council stamped banned across its pages and publicly burned every copy. History is often quieter than conspiracy. What seems to have happened is more gradual, changing standards, shifting boundaries, and the slow narrowing of what counted as authoritative scripture across different regions of the Christian world. For a time, Enochic ideas circulated widely. Early Jewish groups engaged with it. Some Christian writers referenced it approvingly. And one of the most striking details is that a passage attributed to Enoch appears in the New Testament letter of Jude, where the author presents it as a prophetic voice. That alone ensured Enoch would never fully vanish from discussion, because once a later sacred text points back to it, curiosity becomes inevitable. Yet over time, many Western churches moved toward a more unified collection of books, one that could be broadly recognized and consistently read in public worship. Works that were not widely received across all communities, or that did not align neatly with the Hebrew scriptures as understood by many Jewish authorities of the period, were often set aside. Enoch, despite its influence, became less commonly copied in Greek and Latin contexts. Once copying slows, disappearance follows. Books do not survive on reputation alone, they survive because scribes keep reproducing them. There were also theological pressures. The Book of Enoch contains vivid, detailed portrayals of angels' names, hierarchies, cosmic geography, and elaborate accounts of forbidden knowledge. Leaders concerned with doctrine could reasonably worry about what happens when visionary literature is treated like systematic teaching. The canonical scriptures often speak with restraint about the unseen realm. Enoch speaks with abundance, sometimes with startling specificity. For some, that was compelling. For others, it was dangerous. Too many details can invite obsession, speculation, or fringe teachings that grow like vines around the core of faith. And then there is the most unsettling theme of all. Enoch insists that divine beings can fall. That power does not guarantee purity. That rebellion is not limited to humanity. In Enoch's world, corruption is cosmic, and judgment is cosmic too. The story refuses to reduce evil to bad people doing bad things. It portrays spiritual rebellion as something that can infect the world and twist knowledge into a weapon. For believers who wanted a simpler moral landscape, that picture could feel destabilizing, too dark, too expansive, too easily misused. And so, while it continued to live within Ethiopian Christianity, where it remained part of the sacred collection and was copied and read, it gradually slipped out of Western public life. Not necessarily through a single act of suppression, but through the slow mechanics of tradition. What is read stays alive, what is not read begins to die. Now, to feel why these stories still haunt the imagination, you have to step into the world the book paints before the flood, not as a postcard of paradise, but as a stage set for a catastrophic turning. Picture the earth as the ancients imagined it, raw, young, and intensely alive. Mountains thick with forests, rivers that run clean enough to mirror the sky, dawns that feel untouched by smoke or steel. Humanity is still small in number, tribal, close to the soil, living under wide heavens where stars feel near enough to touch. In that world, the boundary between the natural and the spiritual feels thinner. People measure time by seasons and stories, by births and deaths, by storms and harvests. They sense the sacred not in abstractions but in wind, rain, firelight, the sudden hush before thunder. And then, somewhere above that world, the watchers begin to look down not with pure guardianship, but with hunger. The book frames it as a choice, an oath broken. They see human beauty and decide it should belong to them. They see human vulnerability and decide it can be exploited. They cross the line between heaven's order and earth's chaos, and they bring more than desire with them. They bring methods, techniques, secrets, the kind of knowledge that, in the wrong hands, doesn't lift humanity up. It accelerates humanity's fall. At first, it might have seemed like progress. New skills, new crafts, new power. But the Book of Enoch paints a grim pattern. When the soul is not prepared, power becomes poison. Weapons multiply. Pride grows teeth. Jealousy becomes strategy. Violence becomes entertainment. The strong feed on the weak, and the world begins to feel less like a garden and more like a battlefield. And towering over it all are the giant symbols of imbalance, embodiments of what happens when boundaries meant to protect life are shattered. Whether one reads the Nephilim as literal beings, mythic language, or theological metaphor, the point lands with force. Something entered the human story that distorted it, enlarged it, and drove it toward collapse. In that sense, the Book of Enoch is not just forbidden lore. It is a warning about desire without restraint, knowledge without wisdom, power without holiness. It's a story that dares to say the world can be haunted by consequences far larger than a single person's choices, and that even angels, if they choose rebellion, can become agents of ruin. That may be the real reason it was feared, not because it exposes a scandal to gossip about, but because it forces a terrifying thought into the open. The universe is moral. The unseen world is not a fairy tale, and rebellion, whether human or heavenly, has weight. And if that is true, then the pages of Enoch are not merely a curiosity preserved in Ethiopia like an ancient relic. They are a mirror held up to the human heart, asking a question that never goes out of date. What do we become when we reach for what was never meant for us and call it destiny? Legends carried from one generation to the next say that In those earliest days, the sky never seemed to bruise with storm or haze. The air stayed clean and bright, as if the world itself had only just been spoken into being. At night, the heavens opened wide, crowded with stars, so many lights, it felt less like darkness and more like a living canopy, a vast ceiling of quiet flames. People looked up and believed they were seen, not watched with cruelty, not measured with suspicion, but observed the way a guardian keeps vigil, patient, steady, alert. In that age, the bond between earth and heaven was not something people debated or doubted. It simply was. There were no walls of mistrust between the human world and the unseen one, no heavy fog of ambition, no hunger to possess what was not meant to be possessed. And then, from the highest reaches of the heavenly realm, a decision was made that would shape everything that followed. God sent a company of angels down to the earth, beings appointed not to rule, not to conquer, not to dazzle humanity into submission, but to stand at the edge of human life and keep watch. They were known as the Watchers. Their charge was plain: observe the children of dust, guard the path of truth, and never interfere with the flow of earthly life. They were meant to be the quiet eyes of heaven, present, attentive, restrained. So they took their places across the world like unseen sentinels. Some lingered where mountains rose into the clouds, and the wind seemed to carry prayers straight upward. Others remained near rivers that bent like silver threads through fertile valleys, where families gathered, planted fields, and built their lives around the turning of seasons. From their hidden stations they witnessed the small, holy, ordinary things. Children laughing in moonlight, mothers singing as they ground grain, men and women working beneath dawn's first warmth, gratitude offered upward in simple words and simple breath. For a time, it seemed the mission would endure forever. Heaven and earth moved in quiet rhythm, and the Watchers believed their purity would be their protection. They had been trusted with nearness, and they assumed nearness would never test them. But sometimes closeness is the very thing that proves what a soul is made of. Years passed, generations rose and fell, and in the stillness of their duty, something began to shift so subtly that it might have seemed harmless at first. A gaze lingered longer than it should have. Curiosity leaned toward fascination. Fascination warmed into affection. The boundary that had once felt absolute and unspoken law written into the order of creation began to feel, to some of them, like a distance that could be crossed. In the beginning it wasn't an act. It wasn't even contact. It was a thought, brief, forbidden, almost like a spark carried on the wind. But in the law of heaven, even a spark can become a fire. The Watchers were not chosen for strength of arm or brilliance of mind. They were chosen for purity, for steadiness, for the kind of devotion that does not bargain with desire. In the realm they came from, love was not tangled with appetite, and compassion did not blur into possession. They were meant to observe without wanting, to guard without taking, to remain untouched while standing close enough to protect. Yet among humanity, among smiles and warmth and the tender closeness of mortal life, some hearts wavered. And the moment the inner boundary was crossed, something unseen began to crack. Purity, once effortless, became fragile. The bond with heaven, once unbroken, began to fracture, not with thunder, not with spectacle, but with the quiet heaviness of a conscience that knows it has stepped where it should not. It was only a matter of time before thought hardened into decision. Their leader, Samjaza, understood the danger better than any of them. He knew what it meant to step out of order. He knew that if one angel fell alone, that angel would bear the full weight of judgment. But if all took the same step together, if they moved as one, the punishment would be shared, and no one would face the abyss by himself. That was the logic of rebellion, a covenant of mutual ruin, disguised as loyalty. So he gathered the full number, 200 Watchers, and called them to a mountain far from human sight, a place wrapped in cloud and silence. They stood together in a ring, and the air itself seemed to listen. Samjaza spoke with the urgency of someone staring over the edge of a cliff and choosing not to step back. He urged them to swear an oath that they would abandon their post, take human wives, and accept whatever fate followed. Whether their choice brought glory or condemnation, they would share it. no turning back, no one left behind. And the oath was spoken. It rolled across the mountain like a wind that changes the season. In that moment they severed themselves from what they had been. The sacred mission entrusted to them, watch, guard, remain pure, was laid down as if it were nothing more than a cloak to be discarded. A new path opened beneath their feet, and the first steps on that path had only one direction, away from heaven. After the oath, the boundary set since the dawn of creation was crossed. They descended from their hidden places, not as distant guardians veiled in mist, but as beings walking openly among mankind. The radiance of their origin still clung to them. Their presence carried an unnatural gravity, the kind that makes a room fall silent. Their faces held a strange brightness, their forms a strength that did not belong to earth, and their eyes, deep, ancient, unearthly, pulled awe out of human hearts, the way a tide pulls at the shore. For the daughters of men, it was unlike anything they had ever seen. It wasn't merely beauty, it was otherworldly allure, power wrapped in mystery, authority wearing the appearance of tenderness. And among them, the watchers once chosen to preserve purity opened themselves to mortal affection. They took wives from among the daughters of men, but these unions were never part of the Creator's design, because they shattered the divide that protected both realms. What had been separate for a reason, what had been ordered to keep life whole, was now blended in defiance. Heaven reached down and took what it was not permitted to take. Earth reached up and welcomed what it could not fully understand. And the consequences, once set in motion, did not pause to ask anyone's permission. Because when boundaries break, something always enters through the gap. And in time, from that breach, the forbidden would have a name, a generation that would not fit cleanly into either world. A race born from the collision of the immortal and the mortal. The world would call them giants. The stories would call them Nephilim. And the earth that had once felt like a garden beneath a clear sky would begin to darken, as if the stars themselves were watching, silent, countless, and unable to look away. What happened next was not simply a scandal in the heavens. It was a violation of design, a collision of two natures never meant to merge. One was immortal, radiant, and ordered toward purity. The other was mortal, fragile, and formed from dust. Out of that forbidden crossing came something new, something the old world had no name for, until it had already begun to ruin everything it touched. The Nephilim. The Book of Enoch portrays them as giants, towering, formidable, beyond ordinary human measure. In their veins ran a mingled inheritance. The power of heaven fused to the appetites of earth. That strange mixture made them terrifying. Their strength was not merely athletic, it was unnatural, overwhelming, the kind that makes resistance feel pointless. But it wasn't their size alone that brought the world to its knees. It was what ruled them inside. Their hearts were driven by ambition, dominance, and violence. They did not see humanity as neighbors or fellow creatures. They saw people as lesser beings, useful when obedient, disposable when inconvenient. And once they realized what fear could buy them, fear became their favorite currency. They took the best fields, they seized the fullest storehouses, they treated entire villages like trophies. The ground shook under their steps, and the earth began to learn a new kind of sound, the rhythm of dread. Homes were burned as casually as brushwood, livestock vanished. Harvests were carried off before they could be gathered. The cries of the powerless rose into the night like smoke, and blood darkened soil that had once been tended like a garden. And still, the worst had not yet arrived. The giants were not only strong, they were insatiable. Hunger in them was not a simple need. It was an appetite without a boundary, an urge that expanded the more it was fed. At first they devoured what the land could offer: grain, fruit, wild game, cattle. Entire seasons of labor disappeared in a single raid. But soon the earth could not keep up. Storehouses emptied, herds thinned, fields were stripped bare. And when the world ran out of things to give, the Nephilim revealed what was always waiting beneath the surface, a violence that did not stop at theft. They swept into settlements, slaughtering anyone who tried to resist. And when the last provisions were gone, the last animals taken, their hunger turned toward the one resource still abundant: human bodies. In Enoch's telling, the earth becomes defiled by blood, and the suffering of the innocent becomes so great it rises like a scream toward the gates of heaven. Survivors fled into forests and ravines, hiding in caves, learning to live like hunted creatures beneath the sky they once trusted. Yet even hiding could not save them for long, because the giants did what unchecked predators eventually do when prey grows scarce. They turned on each other. They fought, tore, devoured their own kind, and the world was swallowed in terror from every direction. At last, the anguish of humanity joined the groaning of creation itself, as if the land could no longer bear what walked upon it. The faithful angels looked down in grief, not as distant spectators, but as witnesses to betrayal. And God, who had given life and established order, would not allow corruption to spread forever. The net of divine justice began to draw tight. Judgment was no longer a distant idea. It was approaching like a storm that cannot be negotiated with. But the Nephilim were only part of the disaster. Their brutality was the floodwater you could see. Beneath it, feeding it, was something even more dangerous: forbidden knowledge. Some of the Watchers did more than abandon their station and take human wives. They began to teach humanity secrets that, in Enoch's worldview, were never meant for mortal hands. Things locked away, not out of jealousy, but because the human spirit was not built to hold that kind of power without breaking. And among the rebels, one name is singled out with particular blame: Azazel. Enoch presents Azazel as a corrupter who armed mankind in both body and soul. He revealed how to shape metal into instruments of death, how to forge blades, cast spears, build shields, and craft armor. Before this, humanity might fight with crude tools and raw strength. After this, killing became efficient. Violence became scalable. A single angry man could now do the work of many, and once the knowledge existed, it could not be unlearned. So blood did not flow only from the hands of the giants. It began to spill between humans as well. But Azazel's corruption, in the story, wasn't limited to warfare. He also taught adornment, yet not as art or celebration, but as manipulation. He showed how to shape gold and silver into ornaments meant to inflame envy. He revealed how to crush gemstones into powders, how to paint eyes and skin, how to turn beauty into a tool that could bait desire and feed pride. In Enoch's moral universe, the issue isn't decoration itself, it's the twisting of appearance into a weapon against humility, the reshaping of the human heart until vanity becomes a kind of worship. And with that, the world's collapse gained momentum. Violence was no longer only physical. It became psychological, social, spiritual. War and lust, conquest and obsession, different faces of the same hunger, began to braid together. Azazel was not alone. Elsewhere, Semjaza, the leader who had called the oath, opened a different door, one that didn't clang like a forge or glitter like jewelry. His corruption moved quietly, through whispers and symbols. If Azazel taught men to master bodies with steel, Semjaza taught them to reach for mastery over fate itself. Enoch describes teachings of enchantments, incantations spoken in secret, markings drawn to summon or influence unseen forces, rites meant to bend another person's will. People learned charms designed for revenge, spells for advantage, methods of divination that promised control over tomorrow. What began as hidden practice spread into appetite. Sorcery became power to be hoarded, traded, and weaponized. Tribes sought it the way they sought iron and land, to dominate enemies, to secure rule, to expand influence. And as these practices grew, worship shifted. People no longer waited on the Creator with patience and reverence. They began to bargain with shadows, offering devotion not out of love, but out of desperation for immediate results. Mystery replaced trust, manipulation replaced prayer, and heaven, in the story's framing, recognized that sin was no longer just a behavior on the surface of society, it had entered deep into the human heart. At that point, the collapse was not merely moral, it became cosmic. Enoch's vision describes a world where the very order of creation begins to fracture. The harmony established at the beginning, where everything moved in its proper place, starts to unravel. Skies that had once been clear grow heavy with ominous darkness. Winds turn sharp, as if the earth itself is shivering. Fertile lands become barren, rivers shrink. Fields that once overflowed with fruit and grain are scorched and exhausted. Life feels strangled beneath the combined weight of violence, fear, and spiritual corruption. In heaven, faithful angels look down with sorrow that cannot be spoken. Friends became traitors, guardians became destroyers, and the light, which had once seemed unshakable, appears to dim against the rising shadow. That is when the story turns from descent to reckoning. God summons 4 archangels, figures portrayed as the highest leaders among the heavenly host, and assigns them a task that is both punishment and restoration. In this tradition, each carries a distinct role. Michael, associated with strength and justice. Uriel, linked with light and wisdom. Raphael, remembered for healing and protection. And Gabriel, the messenger whose authority bridges heaven and earth. Their mission is not described as random destruction. It is targeted judgment, to restrain what has crossed forbidden boundaries and to end what has been allowed to ravage the world. They are charged to bind the fallen watchers in the deepest darkness, sealing them until the final day of judgment so that they can no longer corrupt creation. They are also tasked with bringing the Nephilim to an end, removing the violent offspring of rebellion from the earth, so the world can be cleared for renewal. And when the moment arrives, Enoch frames it not like a human war, but like a cosmic enforcement of order. The atmosphere itself seems to ignite, heaven's power rolling downward like thunder, light pressing back the darkness. Samjaza and the Watchers, once glorious, now desperate, are surrounded. Resistance flares, but it cannot endure. In the story, chains are not merely metal, they are judgment made tangible. The rebels are stripped of authority, bound, and cast into an abyss described as bottomless darkness without relief, imprisonment without end until the appointed day. Azazel, singled out for particular guilt, receives a distinct sentence. He is driven into a desolate wasteland and buried beneath jagged stone, sealed away in a place of ruin, reserved for the most grievous offenders, cut off from influence, cut off from the world he helped poison. And with that, a line is drawn across cosmic history. Rebellion has consequences. Forbidden knowledge is not neutral. Power without purity destroys both the powerful and the powerless. And if the world is to survive, judgment must come not as cruelty, but as the hard mercy that stops corruption from becoming permanent. In that place of punishment, the fallen watchers were not merely imprisoned, they were sealed, bound beneath sacred oaths that could not be undone. They were condemned to endure ages of isolation and regret, waiting for the final judgment of the Most High. What had happened was bigger than a violent confrontation. It was a cosmic verdict, a collision between justice and betrayal, between the light that preserves order and the darkness that corrodes it from within. The fall of the Watchers marked the end of what once seemed like a glorious era, and it stands as a warning written into eternity. No being, no matter how radiant or powerful, can outrun the reach of divine righteousness. Yet the story does not end with chains in an abyss. In Enoch's world, the Watchers' rebellion is not an isolated tragedy. It becomes a fracture line running through creation itself, a wound in the order of the universe. Their betrayal does not stay confined to earth. Darkness spreads upward, like smoke that finds every crack and climbs until it stains the ceiling. And as that shadow rises, so does resistance. The forces of light answer, not as a reaction of panic, but as a defense of sacred order, an insistence that heaven will not become a homeland for treason. This is where many readers begin to connect Enoch's vision to a later biblical image, the war in heaven described in Revelation. Not because the two books must be forced into a single timeline, but because they share a pattern rebellion born in pride and divine order answering with judgment. Through that lens, the fall of the Watchers looks like an early eruption of a larger conflict, and Revelation looks like the thunderous climax. Two windows, different angles, one recurring theme: loyalty and betrayal, light and darkness, truth and the will to twist it. So close your eyes and picture a reality before the world as we know it, hardened into history before human empires, before familiar borders, before the long routine of ordinary time. In that imagined beginning stands a radiant being, called by later tradition the morning star Lucifer. Not a creature of dirt and breath, but a creature of brilliance, near the throne of God, clothed in beauty and power that surpassed earthly language. And yet, inside that brilliance, another flame begins to burn, one that gives no warmth. Pride, envy, a hunger to be first, even if first means tearing down what was built. The story says he looked upon humanity, small, fragile creatures made in God's image, and given dominion over the physical world, and something in him curdled. Instead of delighting in the Creator's generosity, he felt insulted by it. He interpreted grace as theft. Honor given to others became, in his mind, a loss inflicted on him. And because pride cannot remain private for long, he did what rebellion always tries to do. He gathered allies. He pulled a portion of the heavenly host into his grievance and turned dissatisfaction into revolt. Revelation paints the result in stark, thunderous imagery. War in heaven. Michael and his angels oppose the dragon and his angels. The struggle is described not as a debate, but as a collision, will against will, order against chaos. And the outcome is decisive. The rebels do not prevail. Their place is no longer found in heaven. They are cast down, the devil and Satan, the deceiver, thrown to the earth with his angels. In that vision, Michael stands as the unshaken guardian of cosmic order. He is not portrayed as merely strong, but as steadfast strength harnessed to righteousness, power governed by obedience. The imagery becomes luminous, a sword of divine light, brighter than the sun, not just a weapon, but a symbol justice made visible. Thunder becomes the sound of judgment itself, a bell that rings through the heavens. The loyal host advances, not fighting for ego, not fighting for conquest, but fighting so that light remains light and truth remains unbroken. And darkness does not fight cleanly. Darkness never does. It fights with deception, distortion, and the counterfeit miracle of corrupt power. But in the end, the story insists, darkness cannot hold ground in the presence of holiness. It is driven back. It is expelled. Peace is restored to the celestial realm, not because rebellion was misunderstood, but because it was answered. That battle is not presented as ancient spectacle alone. It becomes a mirror for every soul. The perpetual conflict between faith and doubt, loyalty and self-worship, light and the craving to twist light into something that serves the ego. It teaches that darkness can roar and threaten, but it cannot ultimately overthrow the throne of righteousness. And when that great expulsion occurs, when Lucifer becomes Satan, not as a name of honor, but as a name of accusation, the story turns its gaze toward earth, because the cast-out rebellion does not vanish. It relocates. It seeks new ground. It opens a new chapter of trial in the mortal world. Returning to Enoch's frame, the consequences of angelic rebellion continue to spread like contagion. The Watcher's betrayal, the rise of the Nephilim, the flood of forbidden knowledge, violence and corruption, multiplying until creation itself seems to groan under the weight. And at last, a final judgment approaches, not impulsive rage, but deliberate cleansing. In this vision, the world has become so saturated with blood and disorder that mercy takes a severe form, a reset, a purification, a boundary re-established through overwhelming force. And so comes the image of the great flood, God's judgment and, paradoxically, God's mercy. Imagine an ancient world where the original brightness of creation has dimmed, where injustice is ordinary, where cries of the oppressed are so constant they blend into the air like wind. The Nephilim, symbols of devouring violence, trample what remains of peace. Human hearts, infected by fear and forbidden power, turn increasingly inward. Trust breaks. Worship fractures. The earth itself feels tired, as if the land remembers what it was meant to be and cannot bear what it has become. God looks down with sorrow, not passive sadness, but grief that moves toward action. The decree comes like a final sentence spoken with trembling authority. the waters will rise. Not a gentle rain, not a seasonal storm, but a flood unlike anything humanity has ever known, an undoing of the corrupted world, a cleansing meant to wash away what has become unlivable. Clouds gather, the sky closes. Rain pours with a force that feels like the heavens themselves are breaking open. Valleys drown, plains vanish, hills disappear. The works of violence, cities, fortresses, monuments to domination are swallowed by holy waters that do not negotiate with power. Life is swept away, and for a moment the world becomes a vast, roaring silence. Yet within the storm, the story places a single thread of mercy. One righteous man, Noah, chosen not because he is impressive by human standards, but because his heart remains anchored. In an age of chaos, he becomes a quiet contradiction, a person who still listens, still obeys, still trusts the Creator when trust has become rare. God entrusts him with a mission: build an ark. And the ark is more than wood and measurements. It is a symbol of refuge, of preservation, of redemption planted inside judgment. While the world is being cleansed, a seed of future life is being protected. The ark becomes a moving sanctuary, carrying the promise that judgment is not God's final word, renewal is. Inside the ark's wooden ribs, within that floating refuge, set apart from the drowning world, Noah, his family, and the creatures preserved for a new beginning were carried through judgment like a seed sealed inside a shell. The storm did not ask who was powerful. The waters did not bargain with violence. They rose with solemn purpose, swallowing the old age and sweeping away what had become unlivable. In that cleansing, the Nephilim, the fierce, cruel embodiment of betrayal and chaos, could not endure. They vanished beneath the flood, erased from the earth's surface, as if creation itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. And when the waters finally began to recede, they left behind more than silence. They left a world stripped to its foundations, raw and ready, an emptied landscape where life could begin again. Not because humanity had earned it, but because mercy made room for restoration. In that vision, the flood is not only destruction, it is purification. It extinguishes life, yes, but it also washes away the hardened stains of corruption. It is portrayed as a reset of order, a return toward what the world was meant to be. A cleansed earth emerges beneath the light, and hope, quiet, fragile, stubborn hope, sprouts again where despair once ruled. But the Book of Enoch doesn't allow the story to end with receding waters and a rainbow promise. It lifts its gaze beyond history into eternity. It insists that the flood was not the final verdict. The final verdict has a name: the Day of Judgment. In Enoch's imagination, Judgment Day is not merely a sacred event pinned to a timeline. It is the summit of the cosmic journey, the moment when divine justice is revealed fully, finally, and without distortion. Picture it. The heavens blazing with a light too pure to look at directly, the earth trembling beneath that radiance, the entire universe pausing as if all creation is listening for a single sentence to be spoken. Gates of heaven open, mist rolls like living veil. A brilliance pours down that does not simply illuminate faces, it pierces motives. It searches hearts the way fire searches metal. And then, every soul is summoned. Not only the celebrated and the forgotten, not only the righteous and the openly wicked, but everyone, those who lived in the light and those who made peace with darkness. Enoch's vision is relentless in this. Nothing remains hidden. Every secret is uncovered. Every deed is brought forward. The judgment is described as absolute and impartial, no bribes, no loopholes, no excuses dressed in holy language. What was done in shadows is seen for what it truly was. The condemned in this telling are not simply people who made ordinary mistakes. They are those who shattered sacred boundaries, oath breakers who treated truth like a tool, corruptors who led others into depravity, those who spread forbidden knowledge with selfish intent, those who used sorcery, manipulation, and hatred to control lives and poison communities. Some fell into idolatry, turning away from the Creator to worship power, appetite, or spirits that promised quick advantage. Others committed violence without repentance, murder, deceit, greed, exploitation, cruelty practiced so long it became normal. Some defiled the dignity of others through sexual violence and domination. The vision frames these not merely as social crimes, but as cosmic pollution, acts that fracture harmony and scar creation. And so the judgment is severe. The guilty are cast into a place described as utter darkness, lightless, comfortless, echoing with regret. The torment is not only physical pain, it is spiritual consequence. The full weight of one's choices finally carried without denial. Loneliness becomes part of the punishment. No relief, no consolation, no hiding behind crowds or excuses. Enoch depicts it as a warning written into eternity. Sin cannot outrun truth, and nothing corrupted can remain forever in the presence of holiness. Yet the vision is not only terror, it is also reward. The righteous, those who held fast to faith, who chose love over cruelty, humility over pride, truth over manipulation, are lifted into a different destiny. They enter everlasting life beside God in radiant peace, a realm free from suffering and tears, where joy is not fleeting and justice is not delayed. In that final world, unity is not forced, it is natural. The soul is restored to what it was meant to be. And then Enoch expands the panorama even wider. Human history is portrayed as unfolding in 10 great weeks, eras that move toward the end like steps toward a summit. Each age carries its own trials, its own lessons, its own exposure of what lies in the human heart. The judge appears at the conclusion when the fallen age ends and a new kingdom dawns, a world ordered by justice, soaked in peace, and filled with God's presence. The ending is not framed as annihilation for its own sake, but as renewal light reclaiming what darkness tried to keep. From there, the narrative often shifts into a question that still grips Western imagination. Are angels real, at least within Western culture's spiritual and artistic world? Across centuries of Western faith, angels have been depicted as messengers, protectors, and executors of judgment beings who bridge heaven and earth. In Judaism and Christianity, they appear at turning points, announcing births, warning of danger, strengthening the faithful, delivering messages that change history. At the same time, the tradition holds that some angels fell, rejecting holiness, resisting God's command, becoming adversaries rather than servants. That tension, guardian and destroyer, light and fall, has kept angel stories alive because it mirrors something people recognize. Power can be used to protect or to corrupt, and the line between the two can be crossed in a single choice. As symbols, angels have never stayed confined to scripture. They spill into Western art, music, film, and literature because they represent what people long for and fear at the same time: a higher order that cares and a higher power that judges. Artists paint them as winged beings because wings translate the invisible into something the eye can understand. Songs invoke them as comfort. Stories turn them into warnings. Whether a person takes angels as literal beings, spiritual metaphors, or cultural myths, the figure persists because it speaks to something enduring, the desire to believe that life is not abandoned to randomness. And among all angelic images in Western Christianity, one remains the most intimate, the one that feels closest to daily life rather than cosmic spectacle: the guardian angel. In many traditions, it is believed that each person is accompanied by an unseen protector, assigned by God not to replace human responsibility, not to shield anyone from every consequence, but to guide, to warn, to nudge, to preserve. The guardian angel rarely appears in blinding glory. More often, the idea is that it moves quietly, a sudden hesitation that prevents disaster, an unexpected turn that leads away from danger, a whisper of conscience when the heart is about to choose poorly. The comfort of that belief is not that life becomes easy, but that no one walks it completely alone. And if the Book of Enoch reveals anything through its sweeping visions, through watchers who fell, judgment that comes, mercy that preserves it, is this: the unseen world, whether taken as literal truth or sacred story, is presented as morally charged. Light matters, choices matter, loyalty matters, and even when darkness rises, it is never portrayed as the final owner of the world. Some stories, quiet ones, the kind people hesitate to share because they sound too impossible, tell of a moment when someone stops for no clear reason, no warning, no visible sign. Just a sudden heaviness in the chest, an unseen hand pressing the brakes of the soul. They pause, turn back, choose a different street, linger an extra minute, and only later discover that tragedy struck exactly where they were about to step. Other accounts speak of the opposite kind of moment. A person at the end of their strength, collapsed beneath grief or fear, when a calm they cannot explain settles over them like warm cloth. Not a dramatic vision, not thunder or light, just a presence so steady it feels personal, like a hand resting gently on a shoulder, and a voice that seems to say, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." In Scripture, the idea of guardian angels isn't treated as poetry alone. It's spoken of as protection with intent care that moves even when unseen. Psalm 91-11 offers one of the most often repeated assurances. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. The power of that line is not that it promises a life without danger, but that it insists danger is not the whole story. It suggests there is a shield around a person that does not always show itself to the eye, guidance that works quietly, sometimes invisibly, sometimes only noticed in hindsight. And across generations, countless people have said they've felt that kind of help when the timing was too precise, the rescue too strange, the comfort too exact. There are stories from the edges of catastrophe where seconds decide everything. One account comes from a firefighter in New York in 2001. Smoke thickened the air until breathing felt like swallowing ash. Heat radiated off the walls so fiercely it seemed to press through skin and bone. His oxygen was running low. He moved by touch, half blind in darkness, surrounded by the roar of flames and the sudden groan of a structure beginning to give way. And then amid all that chaos, he heard something that didn't belong there. A calm, steady voice, close enough to be trusted, saying, "This way." He turned without thinking and followed a darker hallway. Seconds later, the ceiling where he had been standing collapsed with the force of a wrecking ball. After he was pulled out alive, no one could identify who had spoken. No partner was near enough. No civilian could have been there. For him, the explanation felt simple. He believed his guardian angel had guided him out. Another story is told from California in 1983, during a rainstorm that turned highways into glass. A woman driving home felt her tires lose their grip. The car spun, then flipped, violent, helpless motion, metal screaming against the road. When everything stopped, she opened her eyes, expecting pain and death. Instead, she saw a man dressed in white standing by her door. His gaze was steady, his voice gentle, as if he was speaking to a frightened child. "Everything will be all right." He helped her out, set her safely along the roadside, and stayed just long enough for her to breathe again. When the ambulance arrived, the man was gone, and on the wet ground, she later said, there were no footprints, only her own, pressed into the rain-darkened pavement. Then there are the battlefield stories, the kind soldiers trade in low voices, because laughter feels like disrespect, and doubt feels like betrayal of the dead. One account comes from World War II, on a freezing night in France. An American soldier was separated from his unit after a brutal fight. He crouched in a bomb crater, clutching his rifle so hard his hands ached, listening to bullets cut the air and flares hiss overhead like falling stars. He prayed without drama, just a few words thrown upward like a rope. As dawn began to thin the darkness, a soldier in an unfamiliar uniform appeared nearby, calm and unhurried, as if gunfire were merely weather. He pointed toward a ridge and said, "Go that way." The stranded soldier obeyed because the instruction felt certain. Minutes later, he found his unit just beyond the rise. No one recognized the mysterious guide. No one could explain how he had moved so freely through chaos. Yet the soldier never forgot the calm in that stranger's voice, or the way it sounded less like advice and more like rescue. Some encounters are said to happen in the raw fury of nature. In Kansas, a couple took shelter in their basement as a tornado tore through their town. The door jammed, the house shook. Wind screamed like something alive, heavy with splintering wood and flying debris. In the middle of that terror, They heard something that didn't fit the moment at all. A child's voice singing hymns above them, clear, steady, sweet enough to cut through panic. When the storm passed, they searched the house and the neighborhood. No child was there, no visitor, no explanation. Only a song they couldn't forget and a survival they couldn't fully account for. And then there are stories that are less public, more tender, built around a sickbed and a prayer whispered into darkness. A mother in the Philippines sat beside her infant son, burning with fever. She prayed until her throat tightened, tears falling onto his tiny hands. Around 3 in the morning, she drifted into sleep and dreamed of a figure clothed in white, approaching the child and placing a hand on his forehead. In the dream, the room filled with a gentle light, not blinding, just comforting, like morning arriving early. When she woke, the fever was gone. The doctors later could not explain the sudden turn. And she, like so many who tell these stories, didn't argue with mystery. She received it with gratitude. Even famous voices have shared moments like these, accounts that persist not because they can be proven in a laboratory, but because they match something people feel in their bones. Evangelist Billy Graham once told of a flight over northern Europe that hit severe trouble. The plane shook violently, passengers screamed, flight attendants braced for impact. Yet amid the panic, Graham noticed a young boy sitting calmly, eyes closed, lips moving as if he were speaking to someone close. When they landed safely and the crisis had passed, Graham asked him how he could stay so calm. The boy smiled and said, "My friend was with me the whole time." His parents explained, gently and without drama, "That's his angel." Fire, highways, battlefields, tornadoes, sick rooms, turbulent skies, different settings, same shape of story. Help arriving in a way that feels personal, timely, and strangely gentle. Whether one hears these accounts as literal angelic intervention, psychological survival instincts, or sacred mystery, they carry a consistent message. When people are most vulnerable, many believe they are not entirely alone. And that belief naturally leads into another theme that has echoed through the Bible and ancient tradition for centuries: archangels. If guardian angels are described as quiet companions, unseen helpers who protect and guide, then archangels are portrayed as something larger, weightier, leaders in the heavenly order, messengers whose appearances mark moments when the veil between heaven and earth seems to thin. Their names have been spoken in prayers for generations, not as casual myth, but as symbols of divine roles, justice, proclamation, healing, wisdom, each reflecting a different aspect of God's care for the world. Michael is often named first. His very name is shaped like a challenge. Who is like God? A question that declares the answer before it's spoken. In the book of Daniel, Michael is depicted as a protector, standing watch over God's people in times of danger. In Revelation, Michael becomes the commander of a heavenly resistance, confronting the dragon Satan and driving the rebellion out of heaven. His presence is not only might but loyalty, strength tethered to obedience, power used to uphold order rather than seize it. Gabriel, whose name is often understood as "God is my strength," is portrayed as the herald of turning points. He appears to Daniel with visions that stretch beyond one lifetime. He speaks to Zechariah with news that breaks years of silence, and he stands before Mary with words that alter history, delivering a message so heavy with meaning it becomes a hinge for the world's story. When Gabriel speaks in these traditions, the tone isn't casual. It's destiny entering the room. And Raphael, whose name means God heals, appears in the Book of Tobit, a text preserved in many Christian traditions, moving through the story not as a distant cosmic warrior, but as a disguised companion. He guides a young man through danger, protects him against evil, and teaches him how to bring healing to his father. In Raphael's role, heaven's power is shown as compassion, not spectacle, protection that restores what suffering has taken. Pilgrims have whispered his name for safe passage across dangerous roads, and the sick have spoken it in hospital rooms and quiet bedrooms, praying for healing when medicine feels small against fear. And beyond Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael, whose stories are anchored in scripture and long-cherished tradition, other archangels appear in ancient church memory, and apocryphal writings. Like distant constellations, you can still recognize even when the sky is clouded. Uriel, often called the light of God, is remembered as an angel of illumination, wisdom that cuts through confusion, insight that arrives like dawn. In some traditions, he is the one who warns Noah of the flood, urging preparation before judgment breaks like a storm. Uriel's presence is imagined not as thunder, but as clarity, a lamp set along the dark path of human ignorance, showing what must be seen even when it is hard to face. Sellafiel, sometimes rendered differently in various traditions, is remembered as the angel of prayer, the one who carries the petitions of the faithful like incense before the throne of God. In iconography, he is often shown with hands folded, not in weakness but in reverence, teaching the quiet lesson that humility can be stronger than noise. When fear makes words stumble, Sellafiel represents the belief that even broken prayers still arrive where they are meant to go. Jegudeel is described as an encourager, one who strengthens those who labor for God's glory and rewards faithful perseverance. He stands beside the weary worker, the exhausted caregiver, the leader who feels alone under responsibility, urging them not to abandon the calling simply because the road is long. In this role, Jegudeel becomes a symbol of steadfastness, the courage to continue doing good when no one is applauding. And Barakiel, whose name is linked with the blessings of God, is often depicted holding a white rose close to his chest, a quiet sign of grace given, not earned. In some traditions, he is invoked for the protection of families, and especially for the guidance of children, which is why parents speak of him with particular tenderness. Where Michael feels like a fortress, Barakiel feels like a doorway opening provision, favor, protection that doesn't shout. Together, these 7 archangels are imagined as a kind of heavenly council of service and strength. They are not worshipped, their power is not their own, but they are honored as faithful servants, each role a different thread in one tapestry: justice and mercy, warning and comfort, healing and endurance, prayer and protection. And perhaps that is their quiet lesson, that heaven's work is not one note. It is harmony, strength guided by humility, power restrained by purpose, light applied with wisdom. From there, the story shifts away from councils and cosmic battles into something more intimate, something told in winter voices beside fires, something whispered like a secret meant to keep hope alive. They call her the Christmas angel. It's said that on the coldest nights when snow lies thick on rooftops and every sound is softened under its white weight, an angel walks the quiet streets, not with trumpets, not with spectacle, but as a gentle messenger sent to the weary, the forgotten, and the broken-hearted, reminding them they are never as alone as they feel. Long ago, in a small village tucked between rolling hills, winter arrived early and cruel. The river froze into silent glass. The forest stood bare, its branches black against a sky the color of iron. Work disappeared, food ran thin, and at the edge of the village, in a cottage that creaked in the wind, lived a widow named Miriam with her 2 children, Daniel and Ruth. That year the harvest had failed. By the week before Christmas their pantry held almost nothing, a small loaf of bread hardened by time, and a handful of firewood sticks stacked like a fragile promise. Still, each night Miriam tucked her children beneath thin blankets and sat by the frost-laced window with hands clasped, whispering the same prayer into the dark. Lord, do not forget us this winter. On Christmas Eve, the wind howled down the chimney and rattled the shutters like impatient fingers. The cottage was dim except for a small, stubborn fire, its light flickering over rough wooden walls. The children slept curled close together for warmth. Miriam sat in the silence with worry heavy in her chest. How could she make this holy night feel like Christmas when there was nothing to give but a crust of bread and a mother's love? Then she heard it. A sound so soft she almost blamed the wind. A knock at the door, hesitant, gentle, certain. It came again. Miriam wrapped her shawl tight and opened the door, and the cold rushed in like a living thing. Standing in the snow was a woman unlike any she had ever seen. Her cloak was pure white, nearly blending into the drifts behind her, and though no lantern hung nearby, a faint golden light seemed to cling to her presence, as if warmth had chosen her and refused to leave. Her face was serene. Her eyes were deep with kindness and older than time, as though they had witnessed every winter the world had ever known. In her hands she carried a wicker basket covered with linen. Without speaking, the woman stepped inside. Her movements were unhurried, graceful, as if the cottage were not poor at all but sacred ground. She set the basket on the table and lifted the cloth. Inside was a feast, a warm loaf of bread, a jar of honey glowing amber, a wedge of cheese, and roasted meat still fragrant as if it had just come from the fire. Miriam's breath caught. The children stirred and sat up, blinking sleep from their eyes, staring as if their dreams had spilled into the room. The stranger smiled, and the smile seemed to melt the cold out of the air. She reached for Miriam's hand and touched it lightly, no pressure, no demand, only comfort. Then she whispered words Miriam would carry for the rest of her life. "Peace be with you. The Lord has remembered." Before Miriam could speak, before gratitude could find its voice, the woman turned toward the door. The wind swirled snow into the threshold. Miriam blinked, and when she looked again, the stranger was gone. She stepped outside into the night and searched the fresh snow for footprints. There were none, only an unbroken blanket of white stretching into the dark street, as if no one had ever stood there at all. That night, they ate together by the fire, the bread warm, the honey sweet, the meat rich and filling. But more than the food, it was the peace that stayed, wrapping the room like a thick, unseen cloak. The children laughed, cheeks flushed with joy. Miriam wept not from sorrow, but from gratitude too deep for words. In the years that followed, the village retold the story until it became part of winter itself. Some claimed they had glimpsed the Christmas angel on nights when hope ran thin. Others believed she came only to doors where prayers had risen through long, cold hours. And whether people believed the tale as literal truth or holy symbol, it carried one steady promise. When the world feels coldest and you feel most forgotten, heaven may send a reminder that love has not grown cold. And there is another story the villagers told, one that begins on a mountain pass, in a winter they later called the White Silence. Snow fell early and refused to stop. Roads disappeared, fields vanished. The sky hung low and heavy as if it might collapse. Even the flap of a bird's wings sounded loud against the hush. On the third week of Advent, 3 travelers made their way across the pass, pilgrims bound for a chapel far to the north, where it was said a fragment of the true cross was kept. The first was an old man named Elias, carrying a worn leather satchel and his most treasured possession, a small Bible given to him by his mother when he was a boy. The second was Jonah, younger, broad-shouldered, but limping from an old wound that ached worse in cold. The third was Matthew, a scholar who had left the warmth of his study for this journey, hungry for something books could not give him. By midday, a fierce wind swept down from the peaks, hurling snow like 1,000 tiny knives into their faces. The path vanished beneath fresh drifts. Their feet sank deep. Every step became a burden. And when night fell, the temperature dropped so sharply their breath crystallized in the air. Darkness closed in, and they realized, with a quiet terror, that they were lost. Their hands burned with cold. Their legs shook with exhaustion. The thought of stopping just for a moment, just to rest, tempted them like a lullaby. They knew what it meant. Rest in snow becomes sleep. Sleep becomes silence. Then, through the swirling white, they saw a light. Faint at first, like a candle far away, it grew brighter as they stumbled forward. And in the middle of the path stood a figure in a long white cloak. The hood covered her hair, but beneath it they saw eyes that seemed to reflect starlight, steady, calm, knowing. She said nothing. She simply turned and began to walk. The travelers followed, too weary to question, drawn by the certainty of her steps. Snow whipped around them, yet she moved as if the storm were powerless. Her footprints left no mark. After what felt like hours, she led them to a small cabin tucked against the mountainside. Warm light spilled from its single window like mercy made visible. The woman opened the door and motioned them in. A fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with the scent of pine and smoke. On the table sat a loaf of bread, still warm, and 3 bowls of thick stew. They ate slowly, warmth returning to fingers and toes. Elias bowed his head over his Bible, tears falling onto the worn pages. Jonah's trembling eased. Matthew felt a peace settle over him, deeper than food, deeper than fire, like something inside him had finally unclenched. When they turned to thank their host, she was gone. The cabin was quiet except for the fire's gentle crackle. They stepped outside into moonlit snow and searched for footprints. There were none. Only the smooth, untouched white of the mountain and the road ahead visible now, as if someone had pushed darkness aside just long enough for them to survive. By morning, the storm had loosened its grip. The 3 travelers stepped outside, expecting to see the cabin again, to thank the woman in white, to learn her name, to leave something behind that might prove the night had been real. But the cabin was gone. No chimney, no roofline, no doorway, no path cut through the drifts. Only untouched snow and the wide, pale silence of the mountain. They stared at the empty space where warmth and bread had been, where a fire had crackled and steadied their shaking hands. Elias crossed himself. Jonah's mouth opened, then closed again, as if words weren't sturdy enough for what he felt. Matthew walked in a slow circle, searching for any sign, footprints, ashes, even a broken twig. There was nothing. And then, as if the mountain itself had turned them in the right direction while they slept, they realized they could see the valley. The pass was no longer endless. A short walk brought them over the next rise, and there, below them, stood the chapel they had been seeking all along, close enough that the bells seemed to recognize them. When they entered, the sound of those bells rolled through the valley like a living blessing, and all 3 men felt the same quiet certainty settle into their bones. They had been led. Not by luck, not by instinct, by mercy. For the rest of their lives they spoke of that night of the woman in white who came in the storm, guided them without fear, warmed them without questions, and vanished without leaving a single trace. Some in later years said she must have been a saint. Others called it a vision grace given to exhausted minds. But the travelers never argued about names. They only said what their hearts had already decided. An angel had walked beside them to remind them that no road is truly lost when heaven chooses to come near. And once a person believes that, the world begins to feel different. Because suddenly, it isn't only storms and mountains where angels might move. Sometimes they appear in gentler ways, in colors, in bells, in dreams, in classrooms filled with chalk dust and ordinary laughter. Sometimes the message isn't a command. It's a reassurance, written into the day itself. I am here. I have not forgotten you. That's how another story begins. One whispered along the shore of a quiet fishing village in Italy, told by elders when the sea is calm and the stars hang sharp in the night air. They call it the angel who painted the sky. Long ago, they say, before the world knew dawn the way we know it now, morning arrived in pale grey silence. The horizon was just a hard line where a colourless sea met a colourless sky. Fishermen pushed their small wooden boats into the water before sunrise and rowed through a stillness that felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. In the heart of the village lived a boy named Luca. His parents had been taken by a storm when he was very young, and though the fishermen and their wives tried to love him like their own, an emptiness stayed inside him, a hollow space the grey mornings seemed to widen. He wandered the beach alone, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn coat, listening to waves and wondering if anyone in heaven could hear thoughts that never made it into words. One winter night the wind cut like a blade, and the air smelled of salt and cold stone. The tide rolled in with a steady rhythm, and Luca sat on a rock, hugging his knees, whispering a prayer he didn't fully know how to shape. He didn't ask for wealth. He didn't even ask for his parents back. He asked for something smaller, but more urgent, a sign. Not thunder, not a miracle for the crowds, just something sure enough to tell him he hadn't been forgotten. At first, there was only the sea. Then, far out across the water, a soft light began to grow. It shimmered just above the waves, moving closer, brightening until it no longer resembled moonlight. It was warm, alive, and from within that radiance stepped a figure robed in white. wings catching faint starlight as if the night itself had turned reflective. She walked across the water as though it were solid ground, her steps leaving ripples that faded into gold. When she spoke, her voice sounded like the hush of tide on a still morning. "Luca," she said, calling him by name as if she had always known it. "The mornings of this world have been empty for too long. Tomorrow I will paint the sky for you, so you will never again doubt that heaven watches over the earth." That night Luca dreamed of jars filled with colors so beautiful they seemed to sing, gold as warm as his mother's laughter, pink as gentle as her touch, blues deep as the calm that comes after a storm finally passes. At dawn he ran barefoot to the shore and stopped, breath caught in his throat. The horizon was alive, ribbons of rose, gold, and violet spilling across the sea. The waves caught the light and shattered it into 1,000 glittering fragments. The wind was soft, and joy quiet. Steady joy settled into his chest like something returning home. The fishermen saw it too. They said it was the most beautiful morning they had ever witnessed. Some blamed sea spirits, others shrugged and called it weather. But Luca kept the angel's promise close because he knew what he had heard. And from that day forward, dawn was never only grey again. Each morning the sky bloomed with color, as though heaven itself leaned close enough to greet the earth. Because the colors, Luca believed, were more than beauty. They were a message painted again and again for anyone who needed it most. "I am here. I have not forgotten you." Then there's another story, told far from the sea in a quiet valley in Poland, where a small stone church has stood for hundreds of years. The villagers say their bell, the heart of the town, was once stolen by the river and returned by an angel. It happened during a summer festival, honoring Street Michael. The bell rang bright and strong across the fields, marking hours, calling people to prayer, blessing weddings, mourning funerals, its sound stitched into the life of the valley. But that year, storms came hard. Rain fell for days, swelling the river that curved around the village like a dark ribbon. On the fourth night, the wind howled and water rose high enough to lick the church steps. The bell rope whipped wildly, and when the river surged, the great bell tore loose and tumbled from the tower. By morning it was gone. The river had swallowed it. Weeks passed. Months. The valley grew strangely quiet. Without the bell, time felt unanchored, as if the village had lost a pulse. Then one misty spring morning, a fisherman named Thomas went to the river before sunrise. Fog lay thick over the water, and the surface was calm, glassy, still. As he cast his net, he heard a sound faint as a hum, deep and warm, rising from beneath the river like a note remembered. It came again, clearer. Thomas knelt at the bank, peering into the fog, and on the far side of the river he saw her, a figure in white standing ankle-deep in the water, hair lifting gently as if moved by a wind no one else could feel. In her hands she held the bronze bell, and though it should have been impossibly heavy, she lifted it as easily as a basket of bread. Thomas tried to call out, but his voice caught. Her eyes met his, calm, luminous, carrying a peace that made panic feel foolish. Without speaking, she walked toward the church, each step silent on the water's surface. By the time Thomas ran to follow, she had reached the churchyard. When he arrived, she was gone. And there, hanging once again in the tower, was the bell, clean, gleaming, as if it had never touched river depths. When the priest rang it that morning, the sound seemed richer than before, rolling across the valley like a warm wave. Some said they heard it not only with their ears but with their hearts, as though the bell itself had become a prayer. And the villagers never doubted the story again. Because once you've heard a bell return from a river, you start to believe in the quiet places where mercy hides. That same quiet belief shows up in stories people tell about children, especially in America, stories spoken in gentle voices during bedtime prayers or at dinner tables when the world has gone quiet. Many parents say children can sense angels more clearly than grown-ups can, not because children are wiser, but because their hearts are still uncluttered. Their fear hasn't learned sarcasm. Their wonder hasn't been trained to apologize. One such story is told about a little girl named Emily, 5 years old, in a small Midwestern town. Her parents noticed that each night after she was tucked in, she would turn toward the same corner of her room and speak softly, almost reverently, like she was answering someone who spoke first. It wasn't playful pretend. There was a stillness in her voice, a listening pause between her words. One evening, her mother asked, "Sweetheart, who are you talking to?" Emily smiled, small but certain. "My friend," she said. "She comes before I fall asleep. She says not to be afraid when it's dark because she's always here." Weeks later, on a night when winter wind rattled the windows, Emily's father checked on her after she'd fallen asleep. He paused in the doorway. Moonlight spilled into the room like silver mist, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw something. Not a person the way people are usually seen. More like a presence, soft, golden light gathered near the head of the bed, shaped vaguely like wings that shifted with the air. The warmth felt almost tangible, like stepping into a room where a fire has been quietly burning for hours. Then it faded, leaving only night. At breakfast the next morning, Emily swung her legs beneath her chair and said matter-of-factly, "My friend says she'll stay until I'm old enough not to be scared anymore." She described a dress like clouds at sunset white, with hints of pink and gold, and eyes that looked like they already know me. She said her wings sounded like wind in trees, and when they wrapped around her she felt warm even if the window was open. Her parents never tried to force an explanation. They simply noticed the change. Emily stopped calling out during storms. She stopped begging for the hallway light. She slept deeply and woke with a calm joy that felt unearned, the way safety sometimes feels when it comes from beyond reason. And maybe that is the heart of these stories, that somewhere between waking and dreaming, the veil can grow thin. And sometimes, just sometimes, God allows the smallest hearts to feel the guardians placed beside them, not to give proof, but to give peace. And then there are the stories that happen in places as ordinary as a classroom. It was an autumn morning. Children remember the crisp air drifting through open windows, the smell of sharpened pencils and chalk dust, sunlight laying warm golden lines across desks. Mrs. Carter's second-grade class worked quietly on math problems, pencils scratching softly, whispers passing between friends. No one noticed at first when the faint smell of gas began to creep into the room. The school's old heating system had just been turned on. Somewhere deep in the pipes beneath the floor, a leak had begun. The air grew heavier, but the children kept writing, unaware. Mrs. Carter, walking between the rows, felt it suddenly a sharp metallic tang in the back of her throat. She started toward the window, and a strange stillness fell over her. From the corner of her eye, she saw someone standing at the classroom door. A woman she did not recognize, tall, robed in white that seemed to shimmer softly, as if catching a light source no one else could see. And in that instant, Mrs. Carter felt the same thing. So many stories begin with an unexplainable certainty, as if heaven itself had stepped close enough to point. Her face was calm, her gaze steady, so steady that Mrs. Carter's first thought was simple and ordinary. She must be from the front office. But before Mrs. Carter could even form a greeting, the woman lifted one hand, palm slightly raised, and spoke in a voice that was both gentle and unarguable. "Take them outside." There wasn't time to question. There wasn't even time to wonder why the words landed with such force. Mrs. Carter felt a cold clarity run through her, the way the mind sharpens when danger is near but not yet visible. She clapped her hands once hard, loud, startling even herself. "Class, line up." 27 small heads lifted, pencils stopped, chairs scraped. "We're going outside for a little surprise break," she added quickly, letting her voice smile so the children wouldn't hear the urgency underneath it. They groaned good-naturedly, happy to escape math, shuffling books into neat stacks before hurrying toward the door. Mrs. Carter guided them into the hallway, counting automatically the way teachers do when their instincts start shouting. As the last child stepped out, she glanced back. The doorway was empty. No woman, no white robe, no shimmer of strange light. Just the classroom, ordinary, sunlit, quiet like nothing had happened at all. They had barely reached the edge of the playground when the explosion came. A muffled, concussive thud punched the air. The ground trembled beneath their shoes. A bloom of smoke rolled up from the far side of the building, and a delayed crackle of shattering glass chased the sound. Children screamed and grabbed one another. eyes wide, hearts bursting with terror, but every single one of them was outside. Every one of them was alive. Later, the fire department traced the blast to a gas buildup in the very classroom they had just left. A leak from the old heating system had been seeping unnoticed until it reached a critical level. One spark, one switch, one static snap had been enough. When the principal questioned Mrs. Carter, she told the truth as plainly as she could. She had seen a woman at the door. She had heard the warning. She had obeyed without understanding why. But no one could identify the stranger. The front office confirmed there were no visitors scheduled that day. No staff member matched the description. No one admitted to being there. The hallway cameras, if they existed at all, showed nothing useful. The record of that moment was contained only in a teacher's memory, and 27 spared lives. Days later, as the children began to process what had happened, several of them said the same thing in their own simple words. As they left the classroom, they felt a warm hand touch their shoulder, gently guiding them forward even though no one was beside them. Mrs. Carter never doubted what she had experienced. For her, the woman in white was not a puzzle meant to be solved. She was an answer, a messenger sent in a critical instant to make sure that 27 small lives would live long enough to see many more autumn mornings. Pencils, chalk dust, sunlight, laughter, all the ordinary miracles that children never think to call miracles until they are almost taken away. And maybe that is how angels work more often than we realize. Stepping quietly into the plain center of a day, speaking only what must be spoken, then fading from view once the work is done, leaving behind nothing but safety and the lingering sense that heaven was closer than anyone knew. From there, the stories climb upward, from classrooms and small-town roads to a mountain in southern Italy, where stone and legend have been holding the same secret for more than 15 centuries. High on the rugged slopes of Mount Gargano stands a sanctuary unlike most places of worship. Pilgrims do not come to admire a cathedral rising into the sky. They come to enter the heart of the mountain itself, a cave where tradition says the archangel Michael once claimed sacred ground. The town that grew around it is Monte Sant'Angelo, and for generations people have climbed its winding paths not for scenery, but for protection. The story begins in the late 5th century, when the land was wild rocky cliffs, deep forests, sudden drops into the blue Adriatic. A wealthy man named Garganus kept a herd of cattle on those slopes. One day a prized bull wandered away. Garganus and his servants searched until they found it kneeling before the narrow mouth of a cave high on the mountain, as if the animal had been called there. Angered and confused, Garganus drew his bow. He loosed an arrow, and the arrow turned. As if caught and redirected by an unseen hand, it curved in the air and struck Garganus himself. He stumbled back, shaken not only by pain, but by the unmistakable message that something beyond his understanding had just intervened. He went to the local bishop. That night the bishop prayed for insight, and in the stillness, tradition says, a brilliant light filled the room. Michael appeared not as a vague impression, but as a presence carrying authority. "I am Michael the archangel," the voice declared, calm and commanding. "I have chosen this place for myself. Here the sins of men will be forgiven. Here my protection will be given to those who seek God." The bishop gathered the people and led them up the mountain. Inside the cave they found a space not shaped by human hands, stone walls rough and ancient, air cool and mineral-scented, and a feeling many described as lingering light, as if holiness had soaked into the rock. Over centuries, the cave became known as a place of answered prayers. Knights, preparing for distant wars, came to seek blessing. Fishermen, before braving Adriatic storms, climbed to leave petitions in the shadows. The sanctuary carried a rare claim. It was among the few Christian holy sites said to have been consecrated not by human ceremony, but by Michael himself. Even today, when you stand at the entrance, you can hear footsteps echo on stone and the murmur of prayers spoken in many languages. And if you stay very still, you may understand what pilgrims have said for centuries, that the archangel who once spoke there still watches, unseen, guarding the faithful, as he always has. And then the stories shift again, away from protection in battle, toward a different kind of gift. the power to preserve truth. Long before libraries rose from marble and wood, before scrolls and ink, before books bound knowledge into something you could hold, human memory was the only archive. Stories lived in breath, and when a storyteller died, whole worlds could disappear as if they had never existed. Tradition says God saw that fragility, and in mercy decided to give humanity a way to keep truth alive beyond one lifetime. So, the legend goes, he sent Gabriel. It was a quiet night on the hills of an ancient land. A young shepherd sat near a small fire while the flock slept in the folds of the valley. Above him the stars were countless, stretched from horizon to horizon like a silver river. The boy carried stories in his heart, the tales his grandfather told him of creation, of flood, of covenant. But fear sat beside those stories. Fear that when his grandfather was gone, the words would vanish like smoke. As he sat thinking, the air changed, stillness deepened. A light began to form among the stars, not the brief streak of a falling star, not moon glow, but a living radiance, pure and steady. It descended slowly, and within it appeared a figure robed in white like polished alabaster, gentle in expression, yet filled with authority that made the boy's breath catch. The shepherd trembled, but he knew without being told who stood before him. Gabriel, messenger of the Most High. And Gabriel spoke like a clear bell over still water. Do not be afraid, child. The Lord has heard your thoughts. He will give you a gift not for you alone, but for all who come after you. Gabriel knelt and took a smooth stick from the ground. Then, in the soil, he drew shapes the boy had never seen, straight lines, gentle curves, marks that seemed to hum with meaning as they formed. These, Gabriel said, are signs by which words can live beyond the breath that speaks them. Through them you may carry truth across valleys and mountains, across years, into the hands of those not yet born. The boy leaned closer, watching the angel's hand move. Gabriel formed names, rivers, hills, the count of sheep in the fold, and then, with a tenderness that made the moment feel holy, he formed the first sacred words of prayer. The air itself seemed to listen. The world held its breath as if creation recognized what was being placed into human hands. Gabriel's patience was endless. He guided the boy's fingers until the marks became steady, and with every repeated stroke, warmth spread through the child, not only in his hands, but in his heart, as if something beyond skill was awakening, responsibility. When the lesson was complete, Gabriel placed the stick in the boy's palm. Writing is a trust, he said. A flame passed from heaven to earth. Guard it well. Use it for truth. What you bind to these marks will outlive you, so do not bind falsehood to them. Then Gabriel rose. The light gathered around him, swelling brighter than dawn, and as he ascended, the air filled with a sound like 1,000 pages, turning at once, soft, immense, like history being born. He was gone, rising back into the star-bright silence, as if heaven had simply folded itself closed again. The shepherd was left alone on the hillside, the fire low, the flock sleeping, the night wind moving softly through the grass. But he was no longer empty-handed. In his palm lay the stick, ordinary wood. Rough and small, yet it felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not weight but meaning. The boy stared at the marks Gabriel had carved into the earth, straight lines, curving strokes. Simple signs that somehow held entire worlds inside them. He traced them again with trembling fingers until his hands stopped shaking and his heart began to steady. Then he did the only thing a soul does when it's been entrusted with something sacred. He practiced. He wrote the marks again and again in the dust until his wrist ached and his fingertips grew numb. He wrote the names of the hills around him, the count of sheep in the fold, the small prayers he had learned as a child. He wrote until the symbols no longer looked like mystery, but like doors. And when morning came and the village stirred awake, he did not keep the gift hidden. He taught. At first the marks spread quietly, scratched into clay, etched into stone, burned into wood. Later, they found their way onto parchment, carried by travelers, copied by candlelight, protected in satchels, hidden in walls during wars, rescued from fires, passed down from hand to hand, like a flame that refuses to go out. The legend says this was how scribes were born, how truth was freed from the frailty of memory and given a body that could endure centuries. And if you listen closely, the story says, you can still hear a faint echo of that first night whenever pen meets page, the soft rustle of Gabriel's robe, the hush of heaven leaning toward earth, and the promise that what is given in truth will not be lost. From there, the old tales turn back even farther to the first closed gate, the first exile, the first sacred boundary drawn in fire. In Genesis, we are told that after Adam and Eve were driven out of Eden, God placed cherubim at the east of the garden, and a flaming sword that turned every way, guarding the path to the tree of life. The gate was sealed. Humanity's first home was hidden from sight. But in ancient Jewish lore, the story does not end with a locked door. The cherubim, the elders say, were not only keepers of a forbidden threshold, they were also appointed as guides, bearers of souls, assigned to lift the righteous along a hidden road called the path of light. It was not a road that returned to the earthly garden. It led onward, upward, toward the presence of the Almighty. These cherubim were unlike anything the mind can hold for long. Their beings shimmered with living fire, yet their radiance was gentle to those under their protection. Each bore 4 faces, a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, signs of wisdom, courage, steadfast strength, and swift, heaven-born purpose. Their eyes were many, unblinking, seeing not only the world of men but the hidden truths behind it. And when they moved, the sound was like a great waterfall, endless, deep, mixed with the low hum of the earth itself, as if creation recognized its guardians. The gate they keep is not described as a simple archway. It stands, the legend says, near where Eden's first river once flowed, its waters now unseen, yet still singing beneath the ground. Vines curl around the threshold, flowering without withering, petals faintly luminous, as if starlight lives inside them. And the flaming sword does not lash wildly. It turns in rhythm, measured, deliberate, like the heartbeat of creation. For the unworthy, it is a barrier that cannot be argued with. For the purified, it becomes a beacon, and in the appointed moment, it yields. When a righteous soul departs this world, the traditions say, the cherubim lower their swords, and the path beyond the gate is revealed. That path is not like any road known on earth. Its surface is woven of gold threads and crystal light stretching past the horizon. Along its edges bloom the trees of Eden, heavy with fruit that smells like life itself. Leaves rustling with music no instrument can imitate. The cherubim do not merely walk beside the soul, they bear it within the circle of their wings, their presence a shield. For the glory of God's throne is described as fire, so pure a mortal heart could not endure it without the shelter of heaven's own messengers. One cherished tale speaks of Enoch, the man who walked with God and was taken without tasting death. When his hour came, the law says, the cherubim descended from the gate, and their light spilled across mountains and rivers, turning night into day. They lifted him beyond the stars, along the path of light, until the air itself was filled with the fragrance of Eden and the song of countless angels. Another story tells of a humble scribe who spent his life copying the Torah with perfect care, each letter formed as if it were prayer made visible. When he died, those keeping vigil swore they heard a distant sound like wings beating over a vast sea. The rabbis said it was the cherubim, come to carry him onward to the garden that is not lost, only kept. And so, in these traditions, the cherubim are not only guardians who keep humanity out of Eden, they are keepers of a promise. The garden is preserved. The story is not finished. A day will come when those who love the Lord with a pure heart will walk again beneath eternal trees, drink from clear rivers, and see the face of God. Until then, the cherubim stand at the gate, flaming swords, both barrier and beacon, marking the place where humanity's story began, and where, in some distant mercy, it may one day return. From the guardians of Eden, the old visions rise higher still to the burning ones who hover near the throne. In Isaiah's vision, the veil between heaven and earth is drawn aside, and the prophet beholds the Almighty, not seated on gold or stone, but enthroned in light, so pure it casts no shadow. Around that throne move the seraphim, the highest order of angels, beings of living flame, radiant with the glory of God. Their very name means the burning ones, yet their fire is unlike any earthly flame. It does not consume, it illuminates. It does not scorch, it refines. Each seraph has 6 wings. With 2 they cover their faces in awe, because no created eye can stare into the fullness of divine glory and remain unchanged. With 2 they cover their feet in humility, and with 2 they fly in effortless, perfect motion. Their voices fill the heavenly temple, and the sound shakes foundations. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. It is not merely a song. It is the language of creation itself, the sound that threads through rivers and mountains, wind and heartbeat, holding reality together in worship. But tradition says the seraphim do more than praise. They are also keepers of the flame of purification, a living fire taken from the altar before God's throne, a fire that cleanses the soul so it may stand in his presence without fear. Isaiah's own calling is the pattern. Overwhelmed, aware of his unworthiness, he cries, "Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips." Then one seraph flies to him, holding a live coal, white gold, radiant, taken from the altar. The angel touches it to Isaiah's lips, and it does not burn the way fire burns. Instead, warmth spreads through him, like forgiveness made physical into body, into spirit, like being fully known and still fully received. The seraph speaks, "Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." From that moment on, Isaiah's words carry heaven's weight, as if every syllable passed through flame and came out purified. Other traditions say the flame is kept for all who will one day see God, a living light that reveals what is hidden. To the righteous, it feels like sunrise after the longest night. To those clinging to deceit, it is a brilliance unbearable until falsehood is surrendered. And in some stories, the seraphim descend in moments appointed by God alone, bringing purification not as punishment, but as mercy that prepares a soul for glory. One tale tells of a humble priest in the early church who prayed night after night for a heart clean enough to serve at God's altar. One winter evening, kneeling alone in a cold sanctuary, the air grew still. A warmth gathered behind him. When he turned, a figure of fire stood there, wings folding like curtains of light, eyes deep as molten gold. The seraph carried a coal glowing with pure white radiance. Without a word, it touched the priest's hands, and in that instant, every shadow in him lifted doubt, bitterness, hidden fear. From that day forward, his prayers brought peace to the sick, reconciliation to the bitter, comfort to those who had forgotten how to hope. So the seraphim are not only distant beings gazing at holiness. In these traditions, they are messengers of mercy, guardians of a fire that refines rather than destroys, preparing the faithful to stand before their Maker. And still the stories continue, because people have always needed reminders that heaven doesn't only bring judgment, sometimes it brings rain. There is a legend whispered in the farmlands of an arid valley, told by grandparents to children beneath the shade of a tree while they wait for the sky to change. It is the story of the angel of rain, a messenger sent not with fire, not with a sword, but with life for a land on the brink of death. The year the story begins was a year without mercy from the clouds. The ground split open into deep, jagged cracks like old wounds. Crops withered before their first bloom, leaves curling into brittle fists against the burning sun. The river that once danced through the valley lay silent and dry. Stones bleached white under merciless light. Each day the wells sank lower. Each morning the villagers walked farther, returning with only a few drops cupped in trembling hands, water shared like treasure, measured like mercy. The air itself felt heavy, unwilling to move. Even the wind seemed to have abandoned the valley. The birds left first, then the animals that still had strength enough to travel. Those that remained moved slowly, ribs showing, eyes dull, their steps careful as if the ground might break beneath them. And in the middle of it all, the people prayed. At first they prayed the way people do when they still believe tomorrow will fix everything, softly, patiently, with the calm expectation that heaven will answer in its own time. But as the days dragged on and the sky stayed a vast ceiling of unbroken blue, the prayers sharpened into something more urgent. Voices grew hoarse, knees wore grooves into church floors. Hope thinned, and still the sun rose pitiless and bright. In the center of the village lived a small group of children too young to work the fields, but old enough to feel the weight in their parents' faces. They saw the worry in the way adults spoke fewer words at dinner. They saw it in the careful counting of grain. They saw it in the hush that settled after someone whispered, "If the rain doesn't come." Each evening, as the light slid down behind the hills, the children gathered at the edge of the empty fields where corn had once swayed like green waves. They sat in a circle, watching the horizon swallow the last strip of day, and they listened to the silence of a land that had forgotten the sound of water. Then one evening, after a day so hot the dust seemed to burn beneath bare feet, the children did something they had never done before. They joined hands. Small, dusty fingers locked together, forming a ring like a promise. And they began to sing the hymns their grandparents had taught them, old songs about the God who once drew water from rock, who fed the hungry, who sent rain when the earth could no longer beg without breaking. Their voices were not loud. They trembled, thin as reeds in a dry creek bed. At first, the heat seemed to swallow the sound, as if the air itself refused to carry their words. But they kept singing, and slowly the song steadied. It rose into the stillness like breath returning to a body that had been too close to death. It filled the empty air, not with performance, but with faith so simple it could only be real. And then the air changed. A cool wind stirred from the west so sudden and clean, the children froze. It carried a scent none of them could mistake, the sharp, living fragrance of rain. They lifted their faces, eyes wide, and saw a figure walking toward them from the far edge of the plain. The figure moved with slow, deliberate grace, as though each step was part of something ancient and ordered. The robe was the shifting grey of storm clouds lined with silver, catching the last light of the sun as if dusk itself had been woven into cloth. From the shoulders rose wings broad and luminous, each feather seeming to hold a drop of water ready to fall. The eyes were deep as a rain-fed lake, calm, reflective, and impossibly kind. When the figure looked at the children, it felt as if every one of them had been seen completely, every fear they had swallowed, every hope they had been too small to name. The angel smiled, and the smile carried both joy and relief, as if this moment had been waited for like a door finally opening. The angel lifted one hand toward the sky and spoke. It wasn't a language the children recognized, yet the sound made the ground hum and the air tremble as if creation itself understood. Above them, the first cloud formed like a shadow against fading light, then another and another. They gathered quickly, thickening, swelling, darkening, until the sky over the valley turned the color of deep water. The first drop struck the dust at the children's feet and vanished instantly into thirsty earth. Then another, and suddenly the air was alive with the music of rain on rooftops, on stone paths, on dry leaves that had forgotten what it felt like to be kissed by water. Rain ran down the old riverbed, darkening it like ink spilled across parchment. Fields drank greedily. The smell of life rose stronger with every heartbeat, wet soil, washed stone, a sweetness that made the lungs feel new. Villagers came running with faces lifted to the downpour. Some laughed like people who had been holding their breath for weeks. Others wept openly. Hands reached upward. Voices cried, thanks to heaven. And every one of them felt the same quiet certainty. This was not ordinary weather. This was response. When they searched for the angel, there was no trace, no footprints, no shimmer in the distance, nothing but the rain falling, as if the sky had finally remembered what it was made for. Only the lingering coolness in the air and the sound of water pouring down like mercy made audible. But the children remembered. They told their parents about the storm-grey robes, the shining wings, the eyes that held the promise of rivers. And from that day on, whenever drought threatened the valley, the villagers gathered their children at the field's edge to sing. And sometimes, when the wind shifted and carried the scent of distant rain, they would look to the horizon and wonder if the angel of rain still walked the earth, waiting for voices pure enough to call heaven near. Then the stories leap forward out of ancient valleys and into the smoke of modern war, where men learned how thin the line is between life and death. The year was 1914. The First World War had begun, and the British Expeditionary Force was retreating through the Belgian town of Mons after its first major clash with a German army that seemed endless in number. The men were exhausted, uniforms caked with mud, throats raw from dust, minds hollowed out by 2 days of fighting and marching without rest. The landscape around Mons had been chewed apart, fields churned into sludge, hedgerows shattered, the air thick with the bitter smell of gunpowder and fear. The retreat felt desperate. Many soldiers believed they would not see home again. German artillery thundered in the distance, each shell landing closer than the last. And it was in that moment, when hope drained out of men like water from broken clay, that the legend says something happened. The sky above the battlefield, grey and low with smoke, began to brighten, not like sunrise, but like a light blooming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Some soldiers said they heard a sound like church bells, oddly clear over the roar of gunfire. Others said the air went still for the first time in days, and a calm settled over them that had no right to exist on a battlefield. Then, the mist along the ridge began to take shape. At first the forms were vague, shifting, luminous outlines. But as the shapes drew nearer, men swore they saw them clearly. Tall beings radiant in white and gold, faces calm yet fierce, eyes fixed on the enemy lines with unblinking certainty. Great wings arched from their backs, shimmering like sunlight on water. Angels, the soldiers called them, because no other word fit. They moved silently above the ground and formed a line between the retreating British and the advancing Germans. Some men insisted the figures carried swords of light, others said they bore shields. But nearly all accounts share the same core. Their presence alone halted the enemy. German fire slowed, then faltered, then stopped, as if the advancing troops themselves had seen something that made them hesitate to step forward. Years later, one private would describe it in a voice too soft for bravado. They stood there, like a wall of light between us and death. I thought I'd gone mad from exhaustion, but every man near me saw them too. And when they turned their faces toward us, it felt like being a child again, safe at home. The retreat continued, yet no charge came. The soldiers reached safety, and the story spread through the ranks like a secret flame carried in whispers. It soon reached villages in England, where mothers and widows found comfort in the thought that their sons had not faced the horrors alone. Skeptics later said it was a mass hallucination born from terror and fatigue. Others argued the legend had grown from a popular story printed at the time and then reshaped by memory. But those who believed held to their conviction. Some said the figures were Michael's host. Others claimed they were the spirits of ancient archers rising again to guard their countrymen. Whatever the truth, the men who carried that vision carried it for life. And in the quiet years after the war, when they knelt in small churches or walked alone at dusk, they would sometimes pause, listening for faint bells in the distance, and remember the day when light stood between them and death. And then the narrative turns, from battlefields to a small home in Nazareth, where the greatest message in Christian memory arrived not with violence, but with grace. Nazareth was quiet that evening. Narrow stone streets lay empty, and olive trees whispered in the wind. In a humble house of clay and stone, a young woman sat near a small oil lamp. Her name was Mary, simple in appearance, modest in dress, yet carrying a heart that lived like a sanctuary. Her prayers were not dramatic, they were sincere. Her life was a quiet offering of obedience and trust. The air in the room grew still, almost expectant, as if creation itself held its breath. And then the veil between heaven and earth parted. God sent his messenger, Gabriel, the archangel, whose name means, "God is my strength." He did not descend like lightning, though he carried the authority of it. His coming was like dawn, unfolding after a long night. Warm, otherworldly light filled the room, chasing every shadow into nothingness. Mary looked up, startled, and there he stood. His robe was like woven pearl, catching light in subtle hues. His wings were vast and strong, arched high above him like shelter. And in that moment, The ordinary became holy, because heaven had entered a small room to speak a sentence that would change history. Each feather was tipped in radiant gold, as if it had been brushed by the very fire that circles the throne of God. His face carried the calm of eternity, ageless, unwavering, and his eyes held a depth like the open sky over a midnight sea. When he spoke, his voice flowed through the room like a river, steady, clear, alive. "Greetings, favored one. The Lord is with you." Mary's heart quickened. She had never seen anything like him, no form so luminous, no presence so weighty, yet she felt no threat. Only awe, as though the air itself had become holy, filled with the breath of God. Still, she pondered his greeting, turning it over in her mind, uncertain what such words could mean for someone as ordinary as she believed herself to be. Gabriel stepped closer. His nearness was both commanding and gentle, like a storm held back by mercy. "Do not be afraid, Mary," he said, and the fear she didn't even know she was carrying loosened at the sound of her name. "You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. Of his kingdom there will be no end." Mary searched his face as if looking for the edge of the impossible, for the place where the words might unravel into dream. But Gabriel did not waver. He was truth standing in light. Her voice was quiet, tinged with wonder more than fear. "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" Gabriel's gaze softened, and his answer came with the calm weight of certainty. "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore the child to be born will be holy. He will be called the Son of God. And behold, Elizabeth, your relative, is with child in her old age. She who was said to be barren is now in her 6th month, for nothing will be impossible with God." In that moment, the light seemed to grow warmer. The room felt hushed, so still it was almost as though time itself had paused. Heaven leaned close, waiting, not because God needed permission to be God, but because love, when it enters a human life, does not crush the will. It invites it. Mary lowered her eyes, and in her silence was not hesitation, but reverence, the kind of courage that does not shout. Then she spoke words that would echo through centuries like a bell. "I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be done to me according to your word." Peace flowed through the room like water finding its course. Something new had begun, not in palaces, not in armies, but in the quiet yes of a young woman. Gabriel's mission was complete. The archangel bowed his head, not as one receiving honor, but as one honoring the mystery of obedience. And the light that filled the home began to fade, not into darkness, but into a gentle, holy calm, as if heaven had kissed the room and withdrawn. Mary was left alone, yet not alone at all. For the presence of the Almighty now rested within her, and the greatest story ever told had taken its first breath, carried on the wings of an angel and sealed by faith. From that sacred threshold, the old traditions lift us again back into the mysteries surrounding Enoch. The man Scripture says walked with God, and then vanished from ordinary history like a candle carried into daylight. Long before kingdoms rose and fell, before nations drew borders across maps, there lived a man named Enoch. He was not a warrior, not a king. He built no monuments. Yet heaven took notice of him, because his greatness was the kind that cannot be measured in stone. Genesis speaks of him with a strange simplicity. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him. In the tradition of Israel, those words are not a poetic ending. They are a door. Enoch did not die as other men die. His life was not extinguished, it was transformed. Jewish tradition expands the story. Enoch was a man of extraordinary righteousness, one who turned neither to the left nor the right from the ways of the Lord. His days were threaded with prayer, his words seasoned with wisdom, his actions shaped by mercy. Each morning he rose before the sun to seek God. Each night he watched the stars, whispering blessings over his people, as if he believed the heavens were listening, and maybe, in some mysterious way, they were. Then one day, the stories say, the skies opened. The presence of the Almighty surrounded him. Light poured down like a living river, and within it stood angels whose faces blazed with the glory of heaven. They took Enoch by the hand and lifted him from the earth, carrying him beyond the clouds, past sun and moon, through gates into the highest heaven. And there, in courts beyond time, God spoke to him not as rumor, not as echo, but as voice. Enoch, faithful servant, I take you from among men to serve before my throne. You shall be clothed in light and filled with the wisdom of ages. From this day forth you are Metatron, my scribe, who will record every word I speak and every deed done under heaven. In an instant, the tradition says, Enoch was changed. Mortal frame became radiant glory, bright as starlight and steady as flame. Wings of light unfolded from his back. A crown like living fire rested upon his brow. His eyes could behold the splendor of the throne without being consumed, because what would destroy the unprepared was now, by God's will, his calling. Metatron was seated near the throne of glory, keeper of the divine archive. Into his care was placed the heavenly book, a vast scroll of living light upon which the decrees of God are written. The rise and fall of kings, the names of the righteous, the hidden acts of kindness no human applause ever found, the prayers whispered into pillows at night, the sorrows carried in silence, the mercy shown when no one was watching. And when Metatron writes, the legend says, the sound is like rushing waters, wide, endless, unstoppable. Every letter burns with the truth of God's will, and not a single stroke will pass away until it is fulfilled. To angels, Metatron is the keeper of record, the one who stands ever before the face of the Almighty, sometimes called the Prince of the Presence. To humanity, he remains a mystery, a bridge between dust and eternity, proof, at least in the language of legend, that a life walked step by step with God can lead beyond the world's limits into a destiny the world cannot offer. And so the tale becomes strangely personal, as if the story is turning its gaze toward the listener. Day after day, in the timeless courts of glory, Metatron's quill moves across the scroll of living light. He inscribes what matters, even when the earth forgets. The moments you chose mercy, the time you offered love when you could have hardened, the prayer you believed was too small to matter. Nothing is wasted in that book, nothing is unseen. And as you rest, the story whispers its final comfort. The same God who called Enoch home watches over you. The same heavens that opened for a faithful man are not closed to the faithful now. Breathe slowly. Let the day loosen its grip. The night is long, but it is not empty. Above you, the stars shine as they have since the beginning, each one a quiet reminder of the one who never sleeps. Close your eyes. Let your thoughts drift like distant echoes. You are safe beneath the shelter of God's wings. And the stories of heaven continue. From there, the narrative returns to something tangible, something made of wood and gold, carried across deserts, wrapped in reverence, the Ark of the Covenant. In the days of Moses, God commanded the building of a sacred chest to bear his presence among his people. Acacia wood overlaid inside and out with pure gold, carried on poles so no human hand would touch it directly. But at the heart of its design was something even more mysterious. 2 cherubim. On the lid called the mercy seat, 2 golden cherubim faced one another, wings outstretched until their tips met, forming a canopy over the place where the glory of God would dwell. Every detail was given by the Lord himself. Their faces turned inward, their wings lifted high in reverence. Their forms wrought with such care that even the folds of their sculpted garments seemed to hold a breath of life. Israel did not treat them as decoration. The people believed the cherubim were symbols of heavenly guardianship, mirrors of the living cherubim who surround God in the highest heaven. And in moments when God's presence descended cloud by day, fire by night, some traditions say the golden figures seemed to shine with a light not of this world, as though the breath of the Almighty moved over them. The ark traveled with the people across wilderness, into battles, even to the Jordan, whose waters parted at its approach. And always the cherubim stood watch, silent and steadfast, their golden wings casting a shadow of mercy over Israel. Tradition holds that the space between their wings was a meeting place between heaven and earth, the place where God spoke not always in thunder, but sometimes in a still, small whisper. And so the cherubim remained, faces turned toward holiness, wings outstretched in silent worship, reminding every generation that in the presence of the Almighty, even the mightiest of angels bow low. Tonight, as you settle down to rest, imagine those golden wings wide and steady, forming a canopy above you. Picture their soft radiance filling the room, warm and unshaken, pressing back every shadow that tries to linger at the edges. The world outside may be restless, but here under the shelter of mercy there is peace. Breathe in slowly. Let the air reach the deepest part of your lungs. Breathe out and let the weight of the day slide from your shoulders as if it were never meant to stay there. Your heart is known by the one who spoke to Moses, the same one whose presence hovered above the mercy seat. His angels still keep watch as they have since the beginning, and tonight they keep watch over you. Close your eyes. Let your thoughts drift like incense rising in the temple, quiet, weightless, carried upward. You are safe, you are loved, and you rest beneath the wings of heaven. Good night, and may you sleep in the light of his glory. And as the room grows still, another story rises, one that begins in a place filled with bright steel and quiet urgency, where life is measured in heartbeats and seconds. It was meant to be routine, if anything involving open-heart surgery can ever truly be called routine. The woman was in her late 60s. For years she had lived with a quiet heart murmur, the kind you learn to carry the way you carry a scar. But now the doctors said it was time. Repair it now, while strength remained. She had faced surgeries before, but never one that felt like standing at the edge of something vast. As the anesthesia began to take hold, her last waking thought became a prayer, simple, honest, whispered into the darkness. Lord, if you will let me wake again. The operating room was cold, flooded by harsh surgical light. Monitors beeped with steady rhythm, tracing each heartbeat, each breath, each small sign that a human life was still anchored to the body. Surgeons and nurses moved with practiced precision, hands confident, voices calm. And then, somewhere in the middle of it all, her heart stopped. She was aware of it not with fear, but with sudden, strange clarity. One moment she was looking up at the lights, and the next she was no longer beneath them. She was above them. She floated near the ceiling as if gravity had released its claim. Below her, her body lay still on the table, small and fragile beneath drapes and wires. She could see the surgeon's furrowed brow, the quick movements of nurses, the anesthesiologist leaning in. She could hear urgency, but it sounded distant, muted, like voices heard through water. And yet she felt no pain, no panic. Only a weightless calm, like stepping out of a heavy coat she hadn't realized she'd been wearing for decades. Then the light changed. Behind her, a glow began to form, warm, golden, alive. Not the hard white of surgical lamps, but something gentler, fuller, like dawn breaking inside the soul. She turned toward it. A figure approached, taller than any person she had ever known, clothed in white so pure it seemed to shimmer with its own light. Great wings arched from his back, each feather edged with silver, as if moonlight had been woven into them. His eyes held the depth of oceans, vast, quiet, and endlessly kind. When he spoke, his voice was both gentle and powerful, like a calm river that could still carry mountains. "Come," he said, extending his hand. "There is something I want to show you." She did not walk, yet she moved beside him, as if drawn by the warmth of his presence. The cold sterility of the operating room dissolved like mist. The beeping faded, the sharp scent of antiseptic vanished. They were somewhere else. A garden unlike any she had ever seen. The colors were deeper than earthly colors, as if the world's palette had been only a faint echo of what was possible. Flowers seemed to glow with their own soft light. The air carried the fragrance of life itself, clean, sweet, filling her as if she were breathing for the first time. A path stretched before them, bordered by streams of crystal-clear water. The sound of it was like laughter remembered from childhood, pure, effortless, healing. And in the distance stood a gate, tall and shining, as though made of woven light. It called to her not with sound, but with the feeling of home. With every moment they drew closer, her longing grew. Not a frantic longing, but a gentle pull, like the tide drawing the heart toward shore. She could feel that beyond the gate was peace, joy, a love so vast it would wash away every sorrow she had ever carried. She turned to the angel, tears gathering in her eyes. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I'm ready." But the angel shook his head, and the kindness in his gaze deepened. "No, child, your work is not yet finished. There are people who still need you. This is not your time." Before she could answer, the garden began to fade. The gate drifted backward as if receding into eternity. The sound of water softened and thinned, the warm light withdrew. And then machines. The steady, rhythmic beeping returned. The bright surgical lamps reappeared. The heaviness of her body rushed back all at once, like gravity reclaiming what had escaped. She gasped, air flooding her lungs, so startling it felt like being born again. Nurses leaned over her, voices urgent but relieved. "We've got her back," someone said. She lived, and she would tell the story many times in the years that followed. Not everyone believed her. Some smiled politely. Some tried to explain it away. She never argued. She didn't need to convince anyone, because for her, the truth was unshakable. She had been to the edge of eternity. A guardian angel had taken her hand, not to lead her through the gate, but to send her back with renewed purpose. And from that day forward, she lived differently. She prayed more. She forgave faster. She held people longer. And in quiet moments, when the air was still, she swore she could feel the faint brush of a wing just behind her, like a reminder that heaven was not far away. And that one day, when her work truly was finished, the gate would open again. Not long after that story, another is told, smaller in years, but no less tender. He was only 9 when it happened. A freckled boy with a backpack too big for his shoulders and a love for riding his bike down the hill near his home. It was a warm spring afternoon, the air smelling of cut grass, the sun resting gently on skin. He pedaled fast, wind in his hair, joy in his chest, until a car came around the corner. The screech of tires came too late. In a single instant, the world flipped, metal struck, his body lifted, and then there was only stillness. When he opened his eyes, he expected pain. He expected shouting. Instead, he found himself standing somewhere else on the bank of a river, unlike any he had ever seen. The water was so clear it seemed made of light itself, flowing without ripples yet carrying a gentle, endless song. The grass beneath his bare feet was soft and warm, as if it were alive. Across the river stood people dressed in white, not a harsh white like snow, but living white, as though the fabric glowed from within. Some smiled and waved as if they knew him, though he could not place their faces. He felt no fear. Only a deep, aching peace, the feeling of coming home after a long journey you didn't realize you'd been making. Beside him, a presence appeared, tall and steady, calm as the river itself. Hair like spun gold caught the light. Great wings arched from his back, each feather glowing faintly like the first light of morning. His eyes carried a kindness that seemed to see straight through the boy, into the center of who he was. The angel knelt, so their eyes were level. His voice was gentle, but it carried the weight that makes a child listen without needing to be told twice. "You can't cross yet," the angel said. "Your mother is crying for you. There are still things you must do in the world." The boy looked at the river, then at the figures waiting on the far side. His throat tightened with longing. "But I want to go," he whispered, and the smallness of his voice broke his own heart. The angel smiled sadly, lovingly, and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "One day you will," he said, "and I will be there to meet you. But for now, go back." Before the boy could speak again, the light of the river began to fade. The figures across the water grew distant, like stars disappearing with morning. The song of the current thinned into silence. And then, voices. Loud, frantic voices. The wail of a siren. The harsh brightness of daylight. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on the street, his head cradled by a paramedic. "Stay with me, kid," the man said urgently. The boy blinked up at him. The memory of the river was still fresh, and the warmth of the angel's hand felt as real as the sunlight on his face. And later, in the hospital, when his mother rushed in with tears in her eyes and relief breaking across her face, he told her everything, every detail, because some stories don't feel like imagination. They feel like a message. She wept openly, holding him close, whispering thanks to God for giving her son back. And the boy, still pale, still shaken, didn't have the words to explain what had happened in a way that would satisfy the world. He only knew what he had seen. He only knew what he had felt. Years passed. Bones lengthened. The freckled face grew into a man's face. The small backpack became a briefcase, then a family, then a life full of ordinary responsibilities. But the story never faded. When he told it, it was always the same, his voice softening when he described the river, his eyes misting when he spoke of the angel's promise. And though he grew older, he carried a quiet certainty like a hidden ember. Beyond this life, the river still flowed, and someone waited on the far side. Then comes another story, set beneath a brutal sun and a sky filled with dust, where a man learned that even war cannot build walls thick enough to keep heaven out. It was the 3rd month of deployment in Afghanistan, and the days had begun to blur together, heat, grit, tension, and the constant discipline of survival. He was 26, but he felt decades older, not just from the weight of his gear, but from the invisible burden of what he'd seen and carried in silence. That morning's patrol was supposed to be routine, a slow, cautious drive along a dirt road where mountains crouched on the horizon like dark watchers. The sun was already punishing, beating down on the metal of the Humvee until it burned to the touch. Wind shoved sand into every seam, eyes, mouth, clothing turning even breathing into effort. And then it happened. A sound like the earth tearing itself open split the air. A blinding flash swallowed everything. The explosion came from beneath them, and the shockwave hurled him hard. His head struck the ground. For a moment the world became nothing but ringing a high, constant tone that erased thought. Then pain, sharp, hot, spreading fast, flared through his leg. He tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't answer. His rifle lay a few feet away, just out of reach. Smoke and dust thickened the air. The metallic scent of blood filled his throat. Somewhere nearby, voices shouted, muffled and frantic, as if he were hearing them from underwater. A second blast rumbled in the distance. The ground trembled like an animal bracing for another blow. He pressed a hand to the wound. Warm blood kept coming, unstoppable, soaking his fingers. The world narrowed to a tunnel of sound and dimming vision. The distant thud of artillery, the ringing in his ears, the sensation of time slipping through his hands like sand. And in that narrowing, he thought of home. His mother's hands, the smell of rain in his hometown, promises he'd meant to keep, words he'd saved for later, apologies he'd assumed he would have time to say. And then he knew, without drama, without denial, he was dying. There was no fear now, only a quiet acceptance that settled over him like dusk. His vision darkened, the noise fell away. Silence. When he opened his eyes again, the desert was gone. The smoke, the blood, the chaos gone. He was standing upright, whole, in a place so beautiful it stole his breath. A vast field stretched in every direction beneath a sky of gold. The light was soft and warm, brighter than any sun he had known, yet it didn't glare or hurt the eyes, it soothed them, like warmth entering cold hands. The air smelled of flowers and something else, something clean and alive, something that felt like the first day of creation. Beneath his feet the grass glowed faintly, swaying though no wind touched it. And in the distance a river of light wound across the horizon, its surface sparkling like liquid glass. Beyond it, farther still, was a radiance so pure that longing rose in his chest like a tide. That's when he saw the figure. An angel was walking toward him, each step slow and deliberate, as if time itself bowed to his pace. He was tall, clothed in white, threaded with silver. His wings arched high and wide, each feather edged with light. His face was strong, but compassion lived in it so deeply the soldier's knees weakened. The angel reached him and spoke, and the sound was unlike anything on earth, deep and resonant like distant thunder, yet calm as ocean waves. "It is not your time. There is still work for you to do. Your family is waiting. Go back." The soldier shook his head. Tears rose without warning. "I can't," he whispered. "Not back to that. Not back to the pain, the war." The angel stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. The touch was warm, steady, sure. And in that instant something entered him, not an order, not a push, but strength that felt like peace given a body. The soldier felt the quiet certainty that whatever happened, he would never be alone again. Then the field began to shift, fading at the edges. The scent of flowers thinned, the river grew distant, the angel blurred. But the warmth of that hand remained to the last moment. He woke to blinding light and urgent voices. A medic leaned over him, shouting for bandages. The pounding of his heart was back heavy, fierce. His lungs dragged in air like they were learning again how to breathe. Pain returned, dust returned, the weight of his body returned. But life had returned too. In the years that followed, he rarely spoke of that day. Maybe because words felt too small. Maybe because he feared people would try to dissect what had saved him. But sometimes alone in his kitchen before dawn, or standing in the rain with his face lifted to the sky, he would remember. And in the depth of his soul, he would hear the same steady sentence like a pulse of light. "It is not your time." And then there is the man who never expected a fall to become a doorway. He was 52, seasoned by decades of work, standing on scaffolding at a construction site with the practical focus of someone who knows how quickly small mistakes become big ones. His hands were calloused. His mind was on the task. Then the planks beneath him snapped. The world tilted, and gravity took hold. The fall was only 3 stories, but it felt endless. He hit the ground hard. Breath vanished from his lungs. Pain tore through his chest as ribs broke and his heart struggled to keep time. He heard someone screaming his name, but the sound was far away, muffled as though underwater. The edges of his vision darkened. Warmth drained from his body. Hands and feet went cold. Panic flickered, then vanished, replaced by a calm he could not explain. When he opened his eyes again, the construction site was gone. No sirens, no shouting, no pain. He was standing in a vast tunnel, not of brick or steel, but of light. The walls glowed with shifting colors, gold and white, woven together like threads of living silk. The air was warm and still, carrying a scent both fresh and sweet, like rain falling on wildflowers. The light ahead drew him forward with a pull that was gentle yet irresistible, like a homecoming. And then he noticed them. On either side of the tunnel, rows of angels stood majestic, robed in garments that seemed spun from the light itself. Each was unique. Some had wings wide and powerful, feathers shimmering like silver frost. Others had wings edged in gold, catching the light like sunrise fire. Their faces shone with beauty that wasn't polished or performative, but pure, reflecting goodness so deep it felt ancient. They did not speak aloud, yet he felt their welcome in the way you feel warmth before you touch a flame. He stepped forward, and the tunnel floor felt soft beneath his feet, as though woven from clouds. With every step, another weight fell away: regret, bitterness, fear, the exhaustion of years. The angels' stillness did not feel cold. It felt reverent, as though they were honoring not him, but the journey. Then he heard it not with ears, but inside himself. A chorus rose from both sides of the tunnel, music vast and harmonious. Each note carried a truth, a promise. The melody spoke of rest, of home, of a love that had been present even when he couldn't feel it. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a brightness so pure he wanted to run toward it. And within that light, though he could not see clearly, he felt a presence greater than all the angels combined, like the source of the love filling the corridor. Then a voice came from the light, deep, calm, carrying the authority of eternity. "It is not your time." The words struck like the toll of a great bell. The angels turned their gaze toward him, and in their eyes he saw both joy and farewell. One stepped forward, taller than the rest, wings like molten gold, and placed a hand over his heart. Warmth poured into him, strength, steadiness, something like heaven pressed into human weakness. The tunnel began to fade. The music softened into memory. Light receded. And then, cold. The sterile tang of antiseptic. The weight of a body, the pain returning all at once, voices shouting commands, a bright surgical light above him. A nurse leaned close and whispered, "We've got you back." Years later, he could never fully capture what he had seen. Words couldn't hold the beauty, the music, the love in those faces. But he knew one thing with certainty. When his true time came, the tunnel would open again, and they would be waiting on either side to walk him home. From tunnels of light, the stories moved to the sea, where a lifetime spent under storms ends. For a moment, on a shore no storm can reach. He had lived nearly his entire life in the Atlantic, an old fisherman from Maine who had weathered waves that would have sent younger men scrambling for land. His hands were thick and scarred from hauling nets. His face was lined by wind and salt and years of watching the horizon. It was late autumn when the storm came. The morning had been too still, the kind of silence old sailors distrust. By midday, the sky turned steel. Wind roared in from the ocean, raising walls of water. He was alone in his small boat when the worst of it struck. Rain sheeted down so hard the line between sea and sky vanished. Each wave rose higher than the last. He fought the tiller until his muscles burned, then a gust hit broadside. The boat lurched. A wave slammed him like a hammer. Cold, that was the first thing as the sea swallowed him, a cold so deep it stole breath from his lungs. He kicked and fought for the surface, but soaked clothes dragged him down. Above him, the last grey light faded. Somewhere in the struggle, his heart gave out. Silence. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in water. He stood barefoot on a shore unlike any he had known. The sand glowed softly like powdered gold, warm beneath his feet. Waves rolled in, not dark and heavy, but made of light, each breaking into cascades of brilliance before melting back into the sea. The sky was neither day nor night, but a vast dome of gentle radiance, filled with a stillness that felt alive. And along the shore, figures approached, tall and graceful, robed in garments that shimmered like water under moonlight. Great wings arched behind them. Their faces carried a peace so complete his eyes stung. They did not speak, yet he felt welcome bloom in his chest like a tide turning. He knew why they were there. They were there to receive him. He stepped toward them, and with each step, a lifetime of labor and worry fell away like an old coat. He was nearly within reach of the nearest angel when he heard it, a voice carried on a wind he could not feel. His wife, calling his name, not the voice of age and sickness, but the voice he remembered from when they were young, warm, full of life. He stopped. The angels paused, watching him with eyes that understood. The sound of luminous waves faded beneath her call. He turned toward the voice, and the pull of it was stronger than the shore, stronger even than the light. The beach began to dim. The glowing sand dissolved. The waves of light became real waves, crashing. Warmth became icy water in his lungs. He woke coughing, sputtering, hands dragging him into a rescue boat. A young man in a yellow raincoat shouted, "He's breathing!" The fisherman lay shivering under a blanket while the storm still raged. But in his heart he carried the image of that other shore, and the angels who had been ready to welcome him home. He told the story only to a few, yet when he did, his eyes went distant, as though he could still see that shore beyond the waves, and hear the voice that called him back. And the legends continue down hospital corridors, across white stone roads lined with angels, over glowing prairies where riders move like dawn itself, each one whispering the same quiet refrain, that the line between earth and heaven is thinner than we think, and that sometimes, when a life hangs by a thread, mercy steps close enough to be felt, the boy whispered. The old farmer managed a weak smile, his breath still thin, his eyes still carrying a faraway glow. "Just had myself a little ride," he said quiet, almost to himself, his words laced with awe, like someone describing a dream that felt more real than waking. For the rest of his life, he didn't speak much about that day. He didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't try to convince anyone. But on quiet evenings, sitting on his porch as the sun sank over the Texas plains and the horizon turned the color of honey and fire, he would gaze out across the fields and feel a strange tenderness in his chest. He would imagine the heavenly prairie waiting just beyond the veil, the glowing grass, the riders of light and the angel on horseback who would one day come, gentle and certain, to take him home. And then, as if the stories were beads on the same thread, another life steps forward, one shaped not by open fields, but by wood grain and patient hands. The Seven Daughters' 8-year-old carpenter and the Cathedral of Light. He had spent more than 60 years working with wood. His hands were shaped by it, rough with calluses, yet gentle in their grip. In his youth, he built houses and barns. In later years, he crafted tables, cradles, and church pews. He loved the quiet honesty of the material, how oak refused to be rushed, how cedar carried its own fragrance like memory. Every project began the same way, with a habit learned from his father, spoken under his breath before the first cut was made. Lord, bless the work of my hands. At 78, his pace had slowed. He no longer climbed ladders or worked from dawn to dusk, but he kept a small workshop behind his home, and it was still his sanctuary. The scent of pine and cedar hung in the air. Sunlight streamed through a dusty window he had looked out of for decades, falling across the workbench in warm stripes. Even the tools felt familiar as friends. One autumn evening, he was planing a piece of oak when an ache bloomed in his chest. At first he ignored it. He had pushed through pain before, but the ache deepened, tightening, crushing until it stole the air from his lungs. The plane slipped from his fingers. He staggered, gripping the edge of the workbench as if wood could hold him up. Then his knees gave out, and he sank to the floor. In the earthly world, the next moments were frantic. His wife's voice sharp with fear, the call for an ambulance, the rush of sirens, the blur of white hospital lights, doctors speaking in urgent bursts. But for him, those sounds fell away quickly, gently, like a radio turned down. And then there was silence. Not empty silence. A deep, golden silence, full of presence. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in a vast open space, a cathedral unlike any church he had ever seen. There were no stone walls, no stained glass, no candles. Yet everything around him was sacred. Every arch and column was made of pure light, rising higher than he could see, glowing with warmth instead of glare. The floor beneath his feet shone like polished gold, but it did not feel hard. It felt alive, like the ground itself was gently aware of him. And music filled the air, not from an organ, not from a choir he could point to. It came from everywhere, thousands of voices woven into one harmony that moved through the cathedral like a living stream. It was a hymn without words, yet he understood it the way the heart understands a sunrise. Welcome, peace, home. Along the great aisles stood rows of angels. Their garments flowed like liquid silver, their wings arched high, catching and refracting the light with subtle movement, as if the air itself was made of praise. Their faces were calm, their eyes deep with compassion, as though they carried the kind of gentleness that has never been forced to harden. From the far end of the cathedral, one angel began to walk toward him. Tall, radiant, his steps made no sound on the golden floor. The carpenter stood still, not because he was afraid, but because something inside him recognized the holiness of that approach. When the angel reached him, he placed a hand over the old man's heart. The touch was warm, not merely physical warmth, but the warmth of being understood completely. "You have built many things," the angel said, voice low and steady, "but there is still time to build more, not with wood and nails." And here the angel's gaze held him gently, but with love. "Your work on earth is not yet finished." The carpenter looked around at the splendor, at the height of light, at the beauty that made him feel both small and utterly safe. A longing rose in him so strong it trembled. "I would be happy to stay here," he admitted, voice breaking. The angel smiled, tender as morning. "One day you will," he said, "and when you do, your place here will be ready." The golden light began to fade, not like a lamp going out, but like the soft closing of a door. The music thinned into a distant hum. The warmth of the angel's hand lingered even as the cathedral dissolved. He opened his eyes to the hospital's harsh brightness. Machines beeped. A doctor leaned over him. His wife's hand was clasped tightly around his own, her eyes wet with relief. In the years that followed, the carpenter often thought of that cathedral. He worked differently. Not faster, never faster, but with a new tenderness, as if every table, every cradle, every repaired chair was a small offering placed quietly into someone else's life. He built as though love could be measured in joints that held, in surfaces smoothed for another hand, in strength shaped for someone else's need. And at night, when sleep came, he sometimes dreamed of walking those golden aisles again. Not with urgency, not with fear, only with the peaceful certainty of a promise that had not been forgotten. One day you will. From there, the stories turn from private visions to public mercy, because sometimes the sign is not given to one person alone, but to a city. The angel at Castel Sant'Angelo. The year was 590, and Rome lived under a shadow that did not lift. Plague had come swiftly, carried on unseen winds, claiming lives day after day. Streets, once loud with merchants and children's laughter, now echoed with the tolling of bells. Bells that rang not for weddings, not for feast days, but for the dead. The Tiber River flowed through the heart of the city, as if even its waters mourned. Pope Gregory, later called Gregory the Great, could not remain behind the safety of church walls while his people suffered. He walked among the sick, prayed with the dying, blessed the fearful, and offered what comfort he could. But he knew human effort alone could not turn back a darkness like this. Rome needed mercy from above. So Gregory called for a great public procession. Clergy, monks, nuns, and ordinary people would walk together through the streets carrying sacred icons and relics, lifting their voices in litanies, one prayer multiplied by thousands of hearts. The morning was grey. The air felt heavy, unnaturally still. People came from every corner of the city, some leaning on canes, some barefoot in penance, some with faces streaked by tears. Their voices rose and fell like waves. Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. The line of pilgrims wound toward the massive stone mausoleum of Emperor Hadrian, a fortress-like tomb that had stood for centuries beside the river. Gregory led the way, the cross held high, his steps steady though his body was weary. As they approached the bridge, Gregory's gaze lifted instinctively toward the top of the ancient walls. And there, against the shifting clouds, he saw a figure, tall, radiant, standing upon the summit as if placed there by heaven itself, robes white as snow, yet lit from within by a light not of the sun, wings stretched wide across the sky, feathers edged with brilliance like molten gold. In his hand was a sword, long and gleaming, alive with an otherworldly fire. For a moment the angel stood watchful, eyes fixed upon the city below. Then, with slow and deliberate motion, he raised the sword high, solemn, and lowered it into its scabbard. The sound was not loud, yet it struck the soul like certainty, final, decisive, as if a decree had been sealed in the unseen realm. In that instant, Gregory understood. The plague would end. The sheathing of the sword was the sign. The battle was finished. Heaven had heard them. Word of the vision spread through the procession like flame. Weary faces lifted. Voices grew stronger. Hope, fragile but real, moved through the crowd. And in the days that followed, the death toll began to fall. Streets cautiously reopened. Life returned slowly, shakily, but unmistakably. From that day forward, the mausoleum was no longer simply a tomb of an emperor. It became known as Castel Sant'Angelo, the castle of the Holy Angel. And in centuries to come, a statue of the archangel Michael would be placed atop its summit, sword in hand, commemorating the moment when Rome believed heaven's warrior had stood guard and mercy had descended. Even now, when the sun sets over the Tiber and shadows stretch across ancient stone, the figure on the castle still catches the evening light, silent, watchful, a reminder that in the darkest times, people have always looked upward, and sometimes they have believed that heaven looked back. They would walk not in silence, but with a single repeated cry, one plea rising from thousands of exhausted hearts. Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. The morning of the procession lay under a ceiling of grey clouds. A cold wind swept through the streets, rattling the shutters of homes sealed tight against sickness and sorrow. Families emerged slowly, as if even stepping outside required courage. Mothers held the hands of children who had seen too much death for their young years. Men walked with heads bowed, clutching candles whose flames shivered in the breeze. Monks in worn brown robes carried relics wrapped in cloth, their chanting deep and steady. Nuns pressed images of the Blessed Virgin to their chests, lips moving without pause. And as the procession gathered strength, the city itself seemed to breathe with their prayer. It grew street by street, corner by corner, until the line of pilgrims wound like a living river toward the massive mausoleum of Emperor Hadrian. The fortress had stood for centuries at the bend of the Tiber, stone upon stone, weathered by time, unshaken by any human grief. It rose like a sentinel, watching over Rome with a silence that felt ancient. At the head of the crowd walked Pope Gregory, holding high a wooden cross. His face was solemn, his steps slow but firm. Now and then he paused to bless the people touching foreheads, lifting tired eyes toward heaven before moving on. And behind him the chant rolled forward like waves. Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. Sometimes it was soft as a whisper. Sometimes it swelled into a cry that seemed to shake the bones of the city itself. And then it happened. As the procession crossed the bridge leading to the fortress, Pope Gregory lifted his gaze to the summit of the ancient walls almost instinctively, as if something unseen had drawn his eyes upward. His breath caught. There, silhouetted against shifting clouds, stood a figure of dazzling light. He was tall beyond mortal measure, majestic, terrible in glory, not frightening in cruelty but overwhelming in holiness. His robes shone like molten silver, flowing as though stirred by a wind no one else could feel. His wings, vast, strong, spread wide across the sky, each feather edged with gold light that pulsed like living fire. In his hand he held a great sword, its blade reflecting a brilliance no earthly metal could match. The angel's gaze swept over the city below steady, searching as if weighing the suffering of Rome in the scales of heaven. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted the sword high above his head. The steel gleamed like a shard of the sun. For a long moment he held it aloft. The air itself seemed to still. Even the chanting faltered as people noticed Gregory's expression, his eyes fixed on the radiant figure above. A hush moved through the crowd like a ripple of awe. Then the angel lowered the sword. The blade slid into its scabbard with a finality that resonated not in sound, but in the hearts of all who saw it, like a door closing on terror, like a verdict of mercy sealed. Gregory understood at once. This was no ordinary vision. The sheathing of the sword was heaven's sign that the plague would end. God had heard their cries. Word of what Gregory had seen passed quickly through the procession. Faces long shadowed by grief began to lift. The chant rose again, stronger now. No longer only a plea but a hymn threaded with hope. Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. And in the days that followed, the death toll began to fall. The sick began to recover. Slowly the streets filled again with the sounds of life, cautious at first, fragile but real. Rome still bore scars, but it also carried memory. The day an angel stood above its walls, and mercy answered a city's prayer. The mausoleum of Hadrian was never called by its old name again. It became Castel Sant'Angelo, the castle of the Holy Angel, and centuries later, a statue of the archangel Michael was placed upon its summit, sword in hand, capturing that moment when heaven's warrior did not strike, but saved. Even now, when evening light catches the blade and turns stone to gold, one can almost imagine the glow of that day when deliverance came to Rome on the wings of an angel. And now, as the story settles, let the voice become gentler like a candle, lowering into calm, because prayer, too, is a kind of shelter. Prayer for the Lord's protection and guidance. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, Almighty and eternal God, in this quiet moment I lift my heart to you with humility and trust. You are my Creator, my refuge, and my shield. From my first breath to this very hour, you have held me in the palm of your hand. Thank you, Lord, for every grace you have poured upon me this day, for the light of morning, for strength to work, for the kindness of others, and even for the trials that teach me to lean more fully on you. All that I have is from your loving heart. Father, I humbly ask that you spread your mantle of protection over me, over my family, and over all those I hold dear. Send forth your holy angels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and all the heavenly hosts to guard us from every danger, every temptation, and every snare of the evil one. May their presence surround us like a wall of light, so that no darkness may enter. Lord Jesus Christ, my Redeemer and Shepherd, guide my thoughts, my words, and my steps. When the road ahead is uncertain, be a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. When fear rises in my heart, remind me that you are near, and that no storm can overpower the one who calms the seas. Holy Spirit, breath of God, fill me with wisdom and understanding. Teach me to discern what is good and pleasing to the Father. Strengthen me to live each day in truth, humility, and love. Let my heart beat in harmony with your will, so that in all things I may glorify God. Blessed Mother Mary, wrap me in your mantle and intercede for me before your Son. Teach me to say yes to God as you did, and to trust his plan even when I cannot see the way ahead. And when the night grows deep and silence surrounds me, keep my soul at peace. Let me sleep under your watchful care, O Lord, knowing I am loved beyond measure. May my dreams be free of fear, my rest free of anxiety, and my heart remain open to your whisper, even as I sleep. Father, I place myself entirely into your hands, my past, my present, and my future. Guard me until the morning light, and when I rise, let my first thought be praise to you, my God and my King, through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Night prayer with my guardian angel. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O holy guardian angel, faithful companion of my soul, you have been with me from the moment my life began. You have seen my first breath, my first steps, my first prayers. You have watched me grow, stumble, rise again, and walk through the winding paths of this life. You know my joys and my sorrows, my victories and my failures, and yet you have never turned away from me. Tonight, as the day comes to its quiet close, I turn my heart to you in gratitude. Thank you for every moment you stood between me and danger, for every whisper you placed in my heart when I was about to choose the wrong path, for every tear you silently witnessed and carried before God in prayer. You see the battles I fight, the fears that keep me awake, the temptations that pull me away from what is good, the burdens I carry in silence. Stand beside me now, my protector and my friend. Let your light pierce the shadows that creep into my thoughts, so that I may rest tonight in the peace of Christ. Surround my home with your presence. Watch over my family, those near and those far. Guard the dreams that pass through my mind, letting only those that lift my heart toward heaven remain. Keep every dark spirit far from my door, and let these night hours be renewal for my soul. Teach me, dear angel, to listen for God's voice, in small and hidden moments, in the stillness of prayer, in the beauty of creation, in the kindness of a stranger. Help me live each day, so that my heart becomes a place where God delights to dwell. And when my earthly days are done, I pray you will take my hand, steady my steps, and lead me along the path of light toward the gates of heaven. There may I finally see you as you are, radiant in the glory of God, and thank you face to face for every unseen act of love you have given me. Until that day comes, walk with me always. Remind me that I am never alone, for the God who sent you to guard me is the same God who holds the stars in his hands and calls me his child. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O holy guardian angel, faithful companion of my soul, you have walked beside me since the very first moment of my life. You have seen every season pass over me, the bright days when joy came easily, and the long nights when sorrow felt heavier than I could name. In my moments of courage and in my hours of weakness, you have known my heart more deeply than I have understood it myself, yet you have never turned away. Tonight, as I set down the weight of this day, I come to you with a grateful spirit. Thank you for every moment you quietly shielded me from harm, seen and unseen. Thank you for the gentle nudges that turned my steps away from choices that would have wounded my soul. Thank you for the prayers you carried for me when I could not find words of my own, lifting my needs and my tears to the throne of God with a patience that never runs dry. You have watched me stumble, and you have watched me rise again. And when I could not stand on my own, when my strength failed and my hope thinned, you stood guard without complaint. Even when I forgot you were near, even when I rushed through life as if I were alone, you remained faithful, not because I earned it, but because God's love does not abandon his children. So I ask you now, guardian angel, stand beside me in this hour. Let your wings form a wall of light around my home. Drive away every shadow of fear, every whisper of despair, and every hidden scheme of the enemy. Let the presence of heaven rest over these walls like a quiet blessing, so that this night becomes a sanctuary, safe, gentle, and filled with peace. Bless my family and the ones I love near and far. Keep them safe in body, in mind, and in soul. Place your watchful care over their steps, their decisions, and their rest. Where they are worried, bring calm. Where they are tired, bring renewal. Where they are hurting, bring comfort that feels like warmth returning to cold hands. And as sleep draws near, guard even the unseen places of my heart. Guide the dreams that pass through my mind, allowing only those that lift me toward heaven to remain. Keep away all darkness that would disturb my rest. Let my thoughts grow quiet. Let my spirit settle. Let my breathing slow beneath the peace of God. Teach me, dear angel, to hear God's voice in the quiet, to recognize his guidance in the small moments, to walk his ways with humility, and to live each day so my life reflects his love, not only in grand acts, but in ordinary kindness, patience, forgiveness, and truth. And when my final day on earth comes, when my journey here is complete, I pray you will take my hand, steady my steps, and lead me along the path of light into the presence of our Lord. There at last I will see what I have only believed. There I will finally behold you in the radiance of heaven, and I will thank you face to face for every unseen act of love you carried out on my behalf. Until that day, walk with me always. Remind me, again and again, that I am never alone. For the God who sent you to guard me is the same God who holds the stars, commands the angels, and calls me his child. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And if tonight's journey has touched your heart, if these stories of faith, of angels, and of God's unfailing presence have brought you even a little closer to peace, carry that light with you into tomorrow. Here, we walk together through sacred mysteries, ancient whispers, and the gentle reminders that heaven is never far away. If you'd like to keep walking this path, to keep listening, learning, and resting in the comfort of faith, stay with us so you don't miss the next step of the journey. Until we meet again, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May his angels guard your path, and may you rest tonight in his perfect peace. Good night, and God be with you always.